Jon Snow had always felt like a ghost in Winterfell, treading the same corridors as his half-siblings yet living in a different world. Even when he was small, trailing after Robb, Sansa, and Arya, he perceived that intangible line that separated him from them. Lord Eddard Stark was kind, but never once did Jon feel the same paternal warmth that he saw bestowed upon his half-brother and half-sisters, or even upon little Rickon. It was not cruelty. Ned Stark was not cruel, but a certain hesitancy that made Jon's young heart wonder if he truly belonged. As a boy, he was consumed by a longing he could barely name. He yearned for acceptance, for a sense of identity, and all the more for the fatherly love that seemed to cool between them like breath against the cold wind. It was a question left unanswered. Who was his mother, and why would his father never speak of her? All the same, Winterfell was home. There was no changing that. The thick granite walls, the creeping vines, the hot springs that wreathed everything in gentle warmth during the bleakest winter nights. Even if Catelyn Stark's distant eyes haunted him at every turn, he cherished the castle and the family that dwelled within it. He learned to train with a sword beneath Ser Roderick's watchful gaze, to ride as swiftly as Robb, to sit quietly in the godswood and pray to the old gods. When Lord Stark glanced at him, sometimes there was a flicker of pain in his face. Over time, Jon came to suspect it had little to do with him being a bastard and more to do with something the boy could not then fathom. He grew older, the suspicious glances from passing lords and ladies, noticing the Stark look in his dark hair and gray eyes, but aware that he was no Stark son in name, hardened him. He strove for honor in his actions. If he could not be a trueborn child, at least he could be worthy of the Stark name. He tried to mimic everything he admired about Robb: loyalty, bravery, a sense of justice. Yet always, a chord of uncertainty thrummed in Jon's chest, doubly so when he saw how the Lady Catelyn's gaze would dim in his presence. But no one ever told him the truth of his birth. No one ever gave him a clue beyond the occasional, almost imperceptible shift in Eddard Stark's expression. Then came the day King Robert Baratheon arrived in Winterfell, accompanied by the Queen, her Lannister kin, and a pageantry of knights and bannermen. Jon kept out of the way as best he could. Even as festivities broke out, as the great hall was filled with revelers and casks of mead, there was precious little place for a bastard at that table. He did his duty as expected, flitting in the background, keeping to his siblings or half-siblings when he could. It was in that swirl of tournaments and feasts that Ned Stark was chosen to be the hand of the king. Sansa glowed with excitement, and Arya sulked at the thought of southern ladies' dresses. Robb tried to appear composed, even though the idea of so many changes unsettled him. Bran was wide-eyed and thrilled at the notion of traveling to King's Landing. Jon saw the tension in his father's face as the time to depart loomed. He was told he'd journey to the Wall to join the Night's Watch. It was not forced upon him. It had been his own urging, in a sense, for he saw little place for himself in a world that did not want him. The bastard son of Eddard Stark in the south would have no future. At least on the Wall, he could forge his own path, rise through the ranks, and serve the realm. It would be a worthy life if a lonely one. But the course of events took a cruel twist when Bran fell from a tower and lay broken. The rumors flew, swirling with the shadows, that the boy might have been pushed, that something more sinister had transpired. Ned Stark left for King's Landing, taking his daughters. Jon parted with the dream of going with him, forced by circumstance to stay at Winterfell just a little while longer until arrangements could be made. He had been only a breath away from stepping onto the King's Road. Instead, he bided his time, restless but determined, and sought an opportunity to say farewell to each sibling. As fate would have it, that delay changed everything. For in the weeks after Lord Stark departed, a strange raven arrived bearing obscure tidings that few could interpret. Maester Luwin, wise though he was, puzzled over the letter in private, speaking in hushed tones with Lord Robb, who had been left behind as the steward of Winterfell in Ned's absence. Jon observed their furrowed brows, their quiet worry, with growing curiosity. When his adoptive mother discovered him loitering outside Maester Luwin's turret, she dismissed him as if he were an errant servant, her voice cold as winter steel. With little recourse, Jon retreated, confusion swirling. The letter spoke of an ancient vault deep beneath an abandoned outpost once built in the style of old Valyria. It should not have mattered. The North had no direct connection to Valyria, a civilization long decimated in the Doom. But apparently, some rumored new threat in the East, Dothraki raids or rumored black magic, had stirred attention in King's Landing. In a flurry of political caution, they had requested Winterfell's assistance in verifying the authenticity of certain relics from Valyria. The line of Targaryens had once possessed the knowledge of their ancestors' empire, but since Robert's rebellion, the Targaryens were near extinct. A small group of archivists in the south believed old Valyrian documents remained scattered across Essos, some hinting at old genealogies and decrees that could rattle the realm if made public. The significance of that letter might have ended there, an academic curiosity, a footnote in the swirl of ongoing politics. Yet Robb Stark, eager to prove himself a capable regent, decided to dispatch Jon Snow and a small retinue to the outpost in question. He wanted to demonstrate to the realm that the North would answer such requests with diligence and honor. Besides, it would busy Jon for a few weeks until the arrangements for his journey to the Wall could be finalized. The outpost in question was perched near the coast, beyond the southern edges of the North's domain but still under the broader banner of the Seven Kingdoms. There was talk of a labyrinth of stone vaults that dated back to House Targaryen's earliest forays west of the sea, from the days before Aegon's conquest. Jon set out with a mixture of curiosity and resignation. He had been bound for the Wall, but what difference would a detour make? Perhaps he would see new sights, glean some knowledge of Valyria, and complete his errand to please Robb. Then onward to the Black Cloak of the Night's Watch, to watch his siblings ascend in rank and memory while he faded behind the ice. A part of him felt uneasy. Each step away from Winterfell, from the presence of the father who had not told him about his mother, was an ache. But he pressed forward as he had always done. He traveled with a small guard, a handful of Stark men, a surly sergeant named Holger, 2 other men-at-arms, and a youthful steward, Colin, who tended the horses. Their journey to the coast was uneventful. They saw small folk laboring in fields, lords' banners flapping over stone keeps, solitary farmers driving sheep across muddy roads. The talk around campfires hovered on concerns of wildling raiders or the possibility of Greyjoy pirates. Yet nothing approached them in violence. The nights were quiet, broken only by the occasional bark of a fox or the moan of the wind. When at last they approached the outpost, Jon was underwhelmed by its appearance. Half-ruined stone walls jutted out from a rocky promontory overlooking the sea. The structure seemed battered by centuries of storms, the stone weathered to a dull gray that bore scant resemblance to the famed black and red edifices of Targaryen strongholds. Yet there was something about the architecture, half familiar, half foreign, that sent an electric thrill through Jon's bones. He could not name it, but in the lines of the jagged towers, in the strange motifs that crowned the archways, he sensed the echo of a lost civilization. They found few inhabitants, an old caretaker and his daughter, plus some guards from King's Landing who had arrived a fortnight prior, searching for the rumored vault. The caretaker's accent was strange, a mishmash of northern burr and coastal drawl. He led them through a labyrinth of corridors that reeked of damp and salt, lichen growing between the cobblestones. Torches sputtered in the cold draft. The caretaker's daughter told them of legends. The outpost had once been a vantage point for dragons before Aegon had turned his attention to Harrenhal. That seemed improbable. Dragons needed grand roosts, not these small, corroded platforms. But Jon listened all the same, an odd flutter in his chest at the mention of dragons. Eventually, in a central chamber, they discovered the entrance to the vault. It was concealed behind a cunningly worked steel door, the metal etched with the sigil of House Targaryen, the 3-headed dragon. The caretaker insisted they had never managed to open it in living memory. The King's Landing guards said the same. They lacked the means to break down the thick steel. They had tried forging keys and even threatened to use casks of black powder, but the risk of collapse was deemed too high. While the men argued about how to proceed, Jon felt compelled to move closer. In the flickering torchlight, the carved dragon seemed almost alive, its serpentine necks twisting and coiling in the gloom. He leaned in, resting a gloved hand against the door. The metal felt warmer than it should have, or perhaps that was just Jon's imagination. A sudden surge of adrenaline pricked at his nerves. Something tugged at him, like the memory of a half-forgotten dream. At first, he chalked it up to a passing fancy, a trick of the light. But as he pressed on the door, there was a low groan, metal upon metal. The watchers murmured in surprise. Jon pressed again, and a subtle click echoed from the mechanism. A hush fell. The caretaker whispered a string of curses in the old tongue, eyeing Jon as though he were some hidden sorcerer. Slowly, with the squeal of ancient hinges, the door began to open. It wasn't easy. It took Jon's full strength, and then the King's Landing guards hurried to help him, pushing until the door yielded. A gust of stale, cold air rushed out to greet them. Torchlight spilled in, revealing a cramped corridor. The caretaker's daughter pressed her knuckles to her lips, trembling at the threshold. Holger demanded to know what manner of sorcery had allowed Jon to open the door. Jon himself had no answer, only that it had felt right, as if something deep inside recognized the emblem, recognized the forging. The King's Landing guards, for their part, seemed awestruck and perhaps fearful, but curiosity overwhelmed fear, and so they ventured inside. The corridor led downward, a spiraling descent into the bowels of the fortress, or perhaps the rock beneath it. They walked carefully, mindful of loose stones. The air smelled musty, of old paper and dust, reminiscent of a tomb. Their torches guttered in the darkness, and each step echoed eerily off the smooth stone walls. Jon led the way, the caretaker's daughter behind him, clutching a lantern. Their breath came shallow, the tension palpable. At the corridor's end, they found the vault. It was a spacious chamber lined with shelves. Upon those shelves were scrolls and books bound in cracked leather, volumes that might have come from the libraries of Valyria itself. The King's Landing guards gaped. They had discovered something precious beyond measure, knowledge that might have disappeared in the Doom centuries ago. A few dusty crates near the center contained relics, ornate daggers, bits of chainmail blackened by time, and fragments of something that might have been dragonbone. The caretaker sank to his knees and marveled. This was a treasure trove beyond anything he had imagined. Jon's pulse quickened as he surveyed the room. It felt strangely intimate, as if the dusty shelves called out to him personally. The caretaker's daughter lifted her lantern, casting warm light on the spines of ancient books scrawled in Valyrian glyphs. The words were indecipherable to most, but for some reason, Jon felt a flicker of recognition. Not enough to read them outright, but enough to sense patterns in the lines and curves. He swallowed hard, and a cold sweat beaded on his brow. They spent hours carefully cataloging the items under the watchful eyes of the King's Landing guards. They made rough inventories, piling scrolls in corners, opening crates to rummage through the relics. Holger jested that perhaps one of the chests might contain gold, but no gold was found, only knowledge. Eventually, the men grew tired and retreated upstairs to rest and discuss how best to transport these archives. The caretaker's daughter helped prepare some bedding in the old outpost's upper levels. Jon, restless, lingered in the vault. He did not fully understand why. The torches were burning low, so he lit another lantern, feeling the dryness in his throat as he turned slow circles around the room. In one corner, a faint glint caught his eye. Kneeling, he found a small chest with an emblem, the three-headed dragon, but inlaid with silver rather than the usual black and red. The lock had long since rusted. Curiosity overcame caution, and he pried it open with the tip of his dagger. Inside were a few brittle parchments rolled tight. Their edges threatened to crumble at his touch, so he carefully, painstakingly, unrolled them across a table. The glyphs were the old style of High Valyrian, quite elaborate. Jon recognized bits from lessons he had overheard when he was younger, times when Maester Luwin had taught Robb or Sansa. The script was too advanced for him to read fluidly, but certain words or names might leap forth. One name, repeated in the text, snagged his attention. Targaryen. Another, Rhaegar. Another, Lyanna. Jon's heart hammered. Lyanna Stark was his father's sister, dead in Robert's rebellion. Why did her name appear in an ancient Valyrian text? The question battered at him like a gale. He knew from the songs that Rhaegar Targaryen had loved Lyanna, that their union had triggered the entire conflict. Ned Stark rarely spoke of it. Indeed, no one in Winterfell liked to speak of it, for it had cost the realm dearly, and the Stark family had paid in blood. Yet here was a text hidden away, referencing them, as though their story was recorded in Valyrian script. Jon furrowed his brow and tried to read further, but the archaic words tested him. He struggled, gleaning only fragments. Child, hidden promise. He spotted Ned Stark's name in Valyrian glyphs, spelled phonetically Edere. Could it be referencing Eddard Stark? His mouth went dry. The final lines repeated a phrase that might translate to the Song of Ice and Fire. With each fleeting translation he managed, his chest tightened, a swirl of emotion building in him. Compelled by a force he couldn't name, Jon lifted one of the scrolls, scanning its lines. Scattered details jumped out. Rhaegar Targaryen's rightful heir, the union with Lyanna Stark, a child. The rest was too difficult to piece together with his limited knowledge. But the fact that those words existed at all ignited a spark of wild hope, or fear, in Jon's mind. It felt like a revelation crouched just behind a veil. Over the following hours, Jon hardly slept. He found a battered dictionary of Valyrian among the stacks, presumably left by Targaryen scribes. By lanternlight he pored over it, matching glyphs, sounding out phrases that twisted his tongue. Time passed in a feverish haze. Now and then he heard the murmur of the sea outside, the crash of distant waves. But the vault drew him deeper, as if its shadows were arms gently enveloping him, urging him to learn more. He began to piece it together. Rhaegar Targaryen had wed Elia Martell, but the record stated he had a second union, a clandestine wedding to Lyanna Stark, recognized by the old rites. Their child had been whisked away, for fear of Robert's wrath. The father of that child was Rhaegar, yes, but the caretaker of that child was Eddard Stark. The text referred to the promise made at the Tower of Joy. Jon's heart stuttered painfully. A swirl of images and half-remembered looks from Ned Stark came rushing back. Jon's entire being trembled as the truth settled over him. He was that child. He was not the bastard of Eddard Stark and some nameless mother. He was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, the heir of a dragon prince, secreted away for his own protection. This changed everything. It was as though the floor had dropped out from beneath him. So many questions roared through his mind. Had Ned Stark known? He must have. He must have lied about Jon's mother all these years. The shame or the danger of revealing a living Targaryen would have been too great. Robert Baratheon would never have allowed such a child to live. Jon stared unseeing at the dusty scroll, his hand shaking. He had always sensed that Lord Stark looked on him with a heartbreak that surpassed guilt. Now it was clear. He was Ned's nephew, not his son. Another piece of heartbreak added to the toll of the rebellion. Jon thought of the king in the south, Robert Baratheon, who had named Targaryens as foes. If Robert had discovered a Targaryen hidden under his nose, would he have marched north with an army and burned Winterfell to the ground to end the Targaryen line? Possibly. Robert had proven merciless after the war. He paced the vault, gasping for air, hardly able to think. He felt betrayed, yet also strangely exultant. Everything he had believed about himself was a lie, but that lie might have saved his life. Ned Stark had done it out of love, to honor his sister's dying wish. Yet where did that leave Jon now? He was heir to the Iron Throne by blood. Robert Baratheon sat that throne, but with the Targaryens supposedly destroyed, no one expected a hidden heir to appear, especially not in the shape of a bastard at Winterfell. The next day, the caretaker discovered Jon in the vault, eyes red from lack of sleep, the scrolls carefully hidden behind him. Jon scrambled for composure. He couldn't let the caretaker or the King's Landing guards glean what he had found. If they suspected, word could slip to the capital. Then everything would change. Perhaps Jon would be executed or used as a pawn to spark another war. Swallowing hard, he insisted he was merely checking the translations. The caretaker's daughter, perceptive, eyed him with pity. She saw how shaky he was, how his mouth turned down in anguish, but she said nothing. Holger came down as well, saw the battered dictionary, and shook his head, muttering that all this fuss over old scrolls was a waste of time. The men from King's Landing hammered crates, preparing to ship these relics south. Jon insisted he needed more time. He tried to be subtle, but he pleaded that certain documents must be studied for authenticity to avoid forging worthless duplicates. The King's Landing men rolled their eyes, but they gave him another day. In that day, Jon carefully copied the crucial text onto scraps of parchment in the common tongue. He wrote by the flickering lamplight, the genealogical line from Aegon the Conqueror to Rhaegar Targaryen, the secret wedding to Lyanna Stark, and the mention of a child's birth at the Tower of Joy. Each stroke of the quill felt surreal, as if a dream were unfolding. Only when he had a passable translation did he destroy the original scroll by tossing it onto a torch's flame. The crisp paper burned quickly, the glyphs vanishing in a burst of heat. Jon felt a pang of remorse, but he could not risk leaving any evidence for others to find. He kept his translations hidden, tucking them inside his cloak. Then came the question, what would he do with this knowledge? Ride straight to Winterfell and confront Ned Stark? Perhaps that was best. He deserved answers. He needed to hear it from Ned's mouth, to know if it was all true. But what then? If Ned confirmed it, would that put him at odds with the king? Did that mean Robert would brand them traitors? There was also the matter of his half-brother, no, his cousin Robb Stark. Robb was, after all, the heir to Winterfell. If Jon declared himself a Targaryen, would that risk splitting the North's loyalties? He didn't want to sow discord. His heart was torn. He kept quiet, letting the days pass until the group readied to leave. The caretaker and the King's Landing men parted ways. Some of the archived material would travel to King's Landing. A smaller portion would be donated to the Citadel in Old Town for scholarly study. Jon departed with the same retinue that had come with him, minus a guard who had chosen to remain behind and facilitate the archivist's departure. During the return journey, Jon was silent, an ocean of thoughts swirling within him. He barely noticed Holger's attempts at conversation or Colin's jokes about the haunted fortress. They arrived in Winterfell to find Robb Stark agitated by news from the south. Ned Stark had fallen into conflict with the Lannisters. Tensions were rising. Arya had vanished briefly, Sansa was betrothed to the odious Prince Joffrey, and gossip suggested that the Lannisters were pulling puppet strings throughout King's Landing. Worse, rumors implied that King Robert had gone hunting and returned gravely wounded. Panic was in the air. Robb was uncertain how to respond. The ravens from King's Landing had grown infrequent and cryptic. Then a single missive arrived, claiming Ned Stark was imprisoned for treason after Robert's death and that Joffrey now sat the Iron Throne. Jon struggled to grasp it all. His father, his uncle Ned Stark, the paragon of honor, imprisoned for treason? Something dark was at play. Robb called the banners, summoning the northern lords to Winterfell. If the crown had turned on House Stark, it was a call to arms. Men from the Umbers, the Manderleys, the Boltons, and the rest of the north began converging on Winterfell. Catelyn Stark, who had been away dealing with her own matters, returned with a fierce determination in her eyes. She hardly spared Jon a glance, but her tension was palpable. As the northern host gathered, Robb prepared to march south. Jon watched from the ramparts, torn by conflicting loyalties. The secret in his possession burned like wildfire in his veins. This was not just about rescuing Ned Stark now. If the Lannisters were consolidating power, if Joffrey sat the throne, there might be no mercy for Ned. War seemed inevitable. Robb Stark intended to lead it. The people of the North were rallying behind him as the new Lord of Winterfell, some even whispering about crowning him king in the North if the realm refused to heed them. In the quiet hours before the host departed, Jon sought an audience with Robb. His brother-cousin sat in Ned's solar, maps spread across a large oaken table. The young man wore the weight of command heavily on his shoulders. "Jon," he said, glancing up, "what do you need? We're running short on time." Jon closed the door. Candlelight cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. "I need to speak to you," privately. Robb's voice softened. Is something amiss? Is it about your place? You know you don't have to join the Night's Watch yet. Not until we. It's something I discovered on that journey south. Those archives we were sent to inspect. Jon's stomach twisted. Robb, I need to tell you something that might change everything. Robb regarded him curiously. His posture was stiff, anxious. What could possibly? Jon withdrew the scraps of parchment he had hidden. Robb's expression grew more puzzled. Slowly, methodically, Jon shared the translation he had made. The genealogical lines, the mention of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark's wedding, the birth of their child, and Ned Stark's vow to protect that child. The truth spilled from Jon's lips in a trembling rush, interspersed with moments of quiet horror in Robb's eyes as he realized what was being said. When Jon was finished, Robb just stared at him, mute. Then, quietly, he said, "Are you sure of this? How can we be certain some old scroll is telling the truth?" Jon's voice wavered. "We can't be absolutely sure, but it explains everything. Why Father never told me who my mother was. Why he was so protective. The timeline fits. The references to the Tower of Joy are accurate. I am certain in my heart that it's true, and I suspect Father will confirm it if given the chance." Robb rubbed a hand across his face, grappling with the shock. "Gods be good. You're telling me you're not a Stark at all, but a Targaryen? That would make you the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, if Rhaegar was heir before he died." Jon flinched at those words. "Maybe in name, but I've never wanted a throne. If anything, I wanted acceptance. Or the Night's Watch. Now this, I don't know what to do, Robb. If the realm learns about this, half of them might want me dead. The Lannisters would use it against us. Robert might have wanted me dead if he knew. But Robert is gone, if the rumors are true, and Joffrey is on the throne now. If Father is in a dungeon, how can I stand by?" Robb took a shaky breath. This changes the chessboard entirely. If you are Rhaegar's son, that might challenge Joffrey's claim directly. Some in the realm might even rise for you if they hate the Lannisters enough. But the North, how would they react? They have no love for Targaryens after what the Mad King did to grandfather and Uncle Brandon. Yet Father always taught us to look past old grudges if the cause was just. Jon's throat felt tight. "I'm still part Stark. My mother was Lyanna. That might count for something." Robb managed a small, humorless chuckle. "Aye, that would be something. But we need Father to confirm this. Without his word, it's a rumor at best, a forgery at worst. The Lannisters could easily dismiss it, or they'd interpret it as proof that House Stark plots treason by supporting a Targaryen contender." Silence dragged between them, thick with implication. Finally, Robb rose and placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "We're marching south in days. We intend to cross the neck and gather more men. You must come with us. If Father is still alive in King's Landing, we'll free him, and then we can learn the truth. If it's real, we'll decide how to use it. But keep this secret close, Jon. If word spreads, it could set the realm ablaze. And we're on the brink of war as is." Jon nodded, relief and fear mingling. Robb's acceptance brought some measure of solace. "I'll keep it secret," Jon murmured, tucking the scraps of parchment away. "Thank you, Robb." And so Jon Snow joined the northern host. He kept Ghost, his direwolf, close by his side, finding comfort in the beast's silent presence. The men marched under the wolf banner, 1,000 strong, a sea of fur cloaks and steel swords. Jon rode near Robb's guard, sometimes scanning the horizon, sometimes lost in thought. War beckoned. Ned Stark's imprisonment was the catalyst for the North's fury. Yet swirling within Jon's mind was the knowledge that he was no mere bastard. He was the final scion of the Targaryen line, if one discounted the exiled Viserys and Daenerys, who were said to be across the Narrow Sea. At Moat Cailin, the lords pledged themselves formally to Robb's cause. They brandished swords and swore to fight for Ned Stark. Jon, standing amidst them, felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. He was certain now that, if revealed, his identity would create a wave of confusion. Could the North truly unite behind someone who was half a Stark and half a Targaryen? Or would it tear them apart? As they pressed south, more grim tidings arrived. Ned Stark had allegedly confessed to treason under the threat of being executed in front of Sansa. The rumors said that Joffrey had demanded Ned's head anyway. A wave of horror passed through the camp. Robb, nearly maddened by grief and rage, vowed vengeance, summoning his council. The assembled lords hammered their fists on the table, crying out that if the Lannisters had murdered Ned Stark, there would be no quarter. The next morning, a raven confirmed the worst. Ned Stark was dead, executed on the steps of the Great September of Baelor. Sansa was a prisoner. Arya's whereabouts were unknown. In that moment, Robb Stark's grief coalesced into something steely and uncompromising. The Great Jon declared him king in the north, and the other lords followed, dropping to their knees and proclaiming independence from the Iron Throne. Jon watched from the edge of the hall, torn by anguish at Ned's death, heartbreak that he would never speak to him again, never hear the truth confirmed from his lips. He felt an emptiness so profound it threatened to swallow him. Ned was gone, his father, no, his uncle, but still the only father figure Jon had known. And the realm was on fire. Now the North marched under King Robb. The war would be against Joffrey, and by extension the Lannisters. Jon wanted to see them pay for Ned's death, for the cruelty inflicted upon Sansa and the unknown fate of Arya. But quietly, in the stillness of night, Jon wrestled with a new question. Was Joffrey truly the rightful king? Or was it him, Jon, who had the stronger claim through Rhaegar? Yet that same claim felt an abomination against everything he had believed, everything Ned Stark had stood for. The realm was in no shape to accept a Targaryen, was it? While camped in the Riverlands, they received an unexpected message from a battered raven that had nearly collapsed on arrival. Catelyn Stark read it first and passed it along to Robb, her face grim. Robb beckoned Jon to his tent, ignoring the eyebrows raised by some of the northern lords who still saw Jon as nothing more than the bastard son. Inside the lantern-lit tent, Robb held the letter in shaking hands. "It's from Ser Barristan Selmy," Robb said quietly, referencing the legendary Kingsguard knight who had been dismissed by Joffrey. "He writes that there are rumors about Joffrey's parentage, that he might be the product of incest between Cersei and Jaime Lannister. If that's true, Joffrey wouldn't be Robert's heir at all. That means Stannis or Renly Baratheon might have a better claim, or—" Robb trailed off, looking at Jon with an unspoken awareness. Jon felt as if the world was twisting. "So Joffrey might be a bastard too," he murmured. "Which means the Iron Throne is vacant if we discount him." Robb nodded. "We're not the only ones who know. This letter says Stannis has declared himself rightful king, and Renly has done the same, each disregarding Joffrey as illegitimate. The realm might break apart further." He sighed, shoulders drooping in the candlelight. "Gods, we are in a tangle of claims and crowns." Jon swallowed, the grief for Ned still raw and throbbing. If the realm descends into chaos, more blood will be spilled. Would the North be safer as its own kingdom? He hesitated, then let the question that had been haunting him slip forth. "Or is it time for a Targaryen claim to be raised?" Robb met his gaze, eyes filled with conflict. "Jon, if father were alive, he would tell us to protect the innocent, to avoid unneeded war. Declaring you a Targaryen heir might either rally half the realm or set them all against us. But with the North already declaring independence—" He ran a hand over his mouth. "I can't rightly see how the lords of the North would swear to a Targaryen. They only just proclaimed me king in the North. They want no southern overlord." Jon's breath came shaky. "Then do we remain separate?" Robb frowned. "Perhaps. But if you were to declare yourself, you'd have the name and the blood. Houses that were loyal to the Targaryens might follow. Dorne hated Robert for Elia Martell's death. They could rally behind Rhaegar's surviving child, especially if they believed you could unite the realm against the Lannisters. Even the Stormlands might side with you if they find out about Joffrey's parentage. It was too much to consider all at once." Jon remembered how Catelyn Stark had looked at him, the perpetual resentment in her face. Would she despise him even more if she learned he was Rhaegar's son? Rhaegar had essentially torn her husband's sister away, sparking the rebellion. There could be no easy acceptance. In the end, Jon lowered his head. "I want no throne, Robb. I loved father. I love the North and I love my family. If it helps you to keep this secret so the North can remain united under your rule, so be it. But if revealing it could save lives or rescue our sisters, if it could rally people to end the Lannisters' hold on the throne, I would do it. I only worry about the cost." Robb sighed, looking burdened beyond his years. "We'll have to play this carefully. For now, let us remain silent. We fight to free our sisters and avenge father. Whether that means acknowledging a Targaryen heir remains to be seen." He squeezed Jon's shoulder. "I'm sorry, truly. It isn't fair that this secret has fallen upon you like a curse. But it might also be a weapon. Used wisely, we can shape the future." From that point on, Jon became a silent partner in Robb Stark's war councils. The Northern Lords mostly tolerated his presence, though a few muttered that a bastard had no business hearing strategies. Robb overruled them. Jon remained quiet, absorbing the talk of forging alliances, making pacts with House Frey to cross the Twins, outmaneuvering Tywin Lannister's forces. The brutality of war became apparent as they crossed the Red Fork, encountering villages ravaged by Lannister raiders. The cries of the small folk, the stench of burning thatch, the sight of mutilated corpses spurred fury in the northern ranks. Jon found himself gritting his teeth, remembering how the Targaryens had once inflicted their own brand of terror on the realm, but also how the Lannisters had sacked King's Landing, murdering Rhaegar's wife and children. The moral lines felt blurred. They scored their first major victory at the Whispering Wood, capturing Jaime Lannister. Jon watched from a vantage point on a rise, heart pounding as the sounds of steel on steel, war cries, and the frightened shrieks of horses echoed. The aftermath was grim, but the North rejoiced that the Kingslayer was now their hostage. Robb hoped to trade him for Sansa and Arya. Yet Catelyn Stark, in a moment of despair and worry for her daughters, struck her own deal behind Robb's back, releasing Jaime in exchange for a promise to return the girls. Outrage seethed through the camp, and Jon found himself at odds with Catelyn again, though he bit back his anger. She only wanted her daughters safe, but releasing their best bargaining chip felt like a dire mistake. Days stretched into weeks. The Lannisters regrouped, and more players entered the war. Renly Baratheon marched with the Tyrells, only to be struck down by some unknown shadow, rumor said. Stannis proclaimed himself king, besieging Storm's End. The realm was fracturing. Jon watched from afar, quiet in the chaos, wondering if he should step forward as Aegon Targaryen, though that name never once felt like his own. He was Jon of the North. Was that not enough? Yet war escalated. Robb's victories in the field were overshadowed by the news that Winterfell had been taken by Theon Greyjoy, who betrayed them. The North reeled. The Great Jon and others demanded that Robb return to crush the traitors, but the Southern Front was also urgent. Ties were unraveling. The Karstarks turned sullen and angry when Jaime Lannister was freed. Alliances wavered. Meanwhile, new rumors circulated of Daenerys Targaryen in Essos, supposedly with dragons of her own. Jon was at the edge of his wits when another piece of news reached them. Joffrey had refused to free Sansa, mocking the Starks by parading her in court. Arya remained missing. The realm's heart bled. Robb's rebellious lords began whispering that the king in the north was losing his grip. Some even demanded that the North withdraw from the conflict entirely, to hold its own borders. "We have no business with the Iron Throne," they said. "Let the Lions and Stannis kill each other." Late one night, as the northern host camped near Riverrun, Jon found Robb in his tent, half slumped over a map with a jug of wine at his elbow. The torchlight cast heavy shadows on the lines of Robb's face. He looked older than his years, weighed down by defeat and heartbreak. Across the table lay scattered letters from lords refusing to send more men, from House Frey demanding new concessions. Robb glanced up and beckoned Jon closer, his voice raw. "The North is fracturing. We don't have the men for a full siege of King's Landing, not after the Karstarks deserted. Winterfell is lost. My mother is at Riverrun trying to hold alliances together, but it's a losing battle. We need something. Jon swallowed, stepping nearer. The realm sees multiple kings. Joffrey, Stannis, you, and there's talk of Daenerys Targaryen across the sea. If we keep splitting like this, the Lannisters grow stronger. They have the wealth of Casterly Rock and King's Landing. We can't face them alone. Robb's eyes gleamed with desperation. But if we had a new claim, if the realm saw a Targaryen-Stark union, it might draw allies who won't side with a rumored bastard like Joffrey or a strict traditionalist like Stannis. It could unify those who loathe the Lannisters but won't bend to a newly declared king in the north. He paused, then gave Jon a meaningful look. If you were to raise your standard as a Targaryen, with me supporting you as your mother's kin, would the lords of the Trident rally? Might Dorne side with you? Could we free Sansa and avenge father? Jon's mouth went dry. That's the choice then? Play the Targaryen card or watch everything fall apart? Robb grimaced. I don't want to force you, but Father wanted to keep you safe. He never wanted you to be used. Yet Father is gone, and the realm is on the brink of collapse. If Joffrey remains unchallenged, or if the Lannisters manage to crush Stannis, they'll turn their full might on us. We need an edge. Jon's head spun. He had never asked for any of this. He thought of Ghost, silent as a shadow. He thought of the vow he'd once intended to make to the Night's Watch. But he was no longer the boy at Winterfell's yard. He had a different destiny. If stepping forward could save Sansa, avenge Ned, and possibly bring some measure of stability to the realm, did he not have a duty to try? He inhaled shakily. If I do this, there's no going back. I'd be taking on the mantle of House Targaryen, Aegon Targaryen. That name alone might incite half the realm to murder me in my sleep. But if it helps us rid ourselves of Joffrey and the Lannisters, Robb set his jaw. We'll do it carefully. We'll rally the Riverlands. Maybe House Tully will stand behind their nephew if it means dethroning the Lannisters. The Vale, too, might be convinced if we can protect young Lord Robert Arryn from Lannister influence. And Dorne, if they learn the last Targaryen heir is also half Stark, and that we respect their grievances over Elia Martell's death, they might lend their spears. It's a slim chance, but it's a chance. Jon nodded, exhaling. Then let's do it. But you remain king in the north. I'm not challenging that. We unite as allies, each a sovereign in our own right, until we can dethrone Joffrey. Robb considered that, then smiled sadly. You would remain separate, then, two kings allied by blood and cause. Jon felt a deep pang. I'm no king of the Targaryens, not truly. But if that's what it takes for these southern lords to join us, then it may be the only way. Within days, the rumor spread quietly among trusted bannermen that Ned Stark had protected the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, and that the boy was Jon Snow, grown into a man of honor. They swore the truth of it by the old gods and the new. Some lords scoffed, calling it a ploy, but others believed, recalling how Ned Stark's sense of honor might have driven him to hide such a child. Catelyn Stark raged in private when Robb told her, feeling betrayed that Ned had fathered no bastard at all, but instead carried out a deception that overshadowed her marriage for years. Nonetheless, she agreed that the knowledge might be used for the sake of rescuing Sansa. Steadily, the movement gathered pace. A small council of the Riverlords, led by the Blackfish, Brynden Tully, recognized that if Jon was truly Rhaegar's heir, he might hold the key to forging alliances that Robb Stark alone could not. The Tullys declared their intention to support Prince Aegon Targaryen, rightful king of the Undulls and the First Men, for the Iron Throne, while simultaneously acknowledging Robb Stark as the king in the north. It was a precarious arrangement, but if it brought swords to their side, they would accept it. Soon, envoys were dispatched. Ravens flew to Dorne with messages explaining Jon's heritage. The letter bore the seal of House Stark and House Tully, vouching for the authenticity of this Targaryen scion. They hinted at vengeance for Elia Martell's murder, that the new Targaryen claimant would honor Dorne's demands. The camp buzzed with rumor and speculation. Soldiers eyed Jon differently as he moved through the lines, some in awe, some in distrust. He was no longer simply the bastard. Whispers of "he's a dragon," "the White Wolf is a dragon," followed him, Jon ignored them as best he could, focusing instead on the tasks of planning and strategy. He felt equal measures of dread and resolve, remembering how Ned Stark had said that the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. If he claimed the right to wage war, he must bear its burdens as well. To everyone's surprise, a response came from Dorne quicker than anticipated. The letter arrived with the crest of House Martell. In it, Prince Doran Martell acknowledged the possibility that Jon Snow was indeed the child of Rhaegar and Lyanna. He demanded proof, but wrote that if it could be proven, Dorne would back Prince Aegon in his claim, as they had once betrothed Elia to Rhaegar. They had remained loyal to House Targaryen until the bitter end. Now, with Elaya's children murdered by the Mountain, they might see justice served if a living Targaryen reclaimed the Iron Throne and punished the Lannisters. That letter ignited fervor in the Northern and River Lords. Suddenly, they saw a path that might end the Lannisters' stranglehold on King's Landing. With a Targaryen name and an alliance with Dorne, they might box the Lannisters from the south while the combined North and Riverlands pressed from the west. Stannis was also in the field, though distant and unyielding. Some even whispered that perhaps Stannis could be convinced to join them if it was proven Joffrey was no Baratheon, though others doubted Stannis would ever submit to a Targaryen. In the midst of this flurry of alliances, Jon was called to a war council in Riverrun's Great Hall. Robb presided, flanked by his mother, the Blackfish, and the other lords. They greeted Jon with a mixture of respect and wariness. Many had not seen him since the rumor spread. The tension was palpable, but they bowed their heads in courtesy. Robb stood. "We are here to decide our next steps. Dorne seems amenable if Prince Aegon, can give them assurance." He gestured to Jon. "We also must clarify how we prove his parentage. Without proof, this is all rumor and no sword." The Blackfish nodded. "We have only scraps of text from an archive, and the word of those who trust Ned Stark's memory. The entire realm may not accept it. In times of war, rumors are as cheap as coppers." Catelyn spoke, her tone ice-laced. "My lord husband is gone. He left no letter, no statement attesting to Jon's parentage. Unless we find survivors from the Tower of Joy, Howland Reed, for instance, who can swear to the truth, we have little. And that might not be enough for the doubters, or the Lannisters." Jon swallowed. "I understand, but we must try. If we can bring Howland Reed out of the neck, he might give testimony. He was one of the knights who stood with Ned Stark at the Tower of Joy. And perhaps father told him the truth. If that is so, Dorne might accept it as confirmation, especially if it is consistent with the text I have." He paused. "We might also ask Master Aemon of the Night's Watch, who's a Targaryen by birth, though he's old and may not wish to entangle himself in politics. But if we had his word on the possibility of my Targaryen blood." Some of the lords exchanged glances. It was not an easy path, but it was something. The conversation turned to immediate strategy. They decided to send ravens to Greywater Watch, urging Howland Reed to come. Meanwhile, the northern host would maintain pressure on the Lannisters in the west, picking off supply lines to King's Landing. The River Lords would defend their territory, while riders carried letters to Stannis and to any lords who might be swayed by the Targaryen claim. The war was about to escalate in new ways. Thus, in the days that followed, Jon found himself entangled in a conflict that was half fought by steel and half by parchment. The northern host moved among the castles loyal to House Stark, fortifying positions, while the River Lords harried Lannister outriders. Jon discovered that the mantle of a Targaryen heir weighed heavily. Men looked to him for leadership, for some flash of dragonfire that might give them an edge. Yet all he had was a sword and a direwolf. He had no dragons, no sure knowledge of how to rule a kingdom. He felt a fraud, but he refused to let that hamper him. He would not fail Ned Stark's memory or Robb or Sansa. Some nights, he dreamt of the crypts in Winterfell, dreamt of hearing Lyanna's ghostly voice begging for his forgiveness. He dreamt of swirling snow that turned into ash as a dragon soared overhead. He would wake in a cold sweat, uncertain which side of him was ice and which side was fire. As the war raged, a shift occurred. Letters from disaffected lords trickled in, some stating that they could not abide a boy king rumored to be the product of incest. A few from the crownlands indicated that if there was a true Targaryen heir, they might be open to negotiations. Even in the Reach, which had once allied with Renly, some lords whispered that they might turn if the Targaryen line was restored, especially if it brought them new privileges. Meanwhile, Stannis pressed his claim with a dour sincerity. Amidst the swirl of politics, how could Robb Stark keep the North out of the southern quagmire and still rescue Sansa? The ultimate goal was to see the Lannisters ousted, but after that, the realm's future was uncertain. Yet the name Targaryen, for all its dreaded associations, also carried a mystique. "It's like dealing with a viper," the Blackfish said once. "Dangerous, but lethal to your enemies if handled well." Day by day, the plan took shape. They would maneuver to lure Tywin Lannister into open battle, trusting Robb's cunning to outsmart him once more. Simultaneously, they would let the rumor of a living Targaryen heir reach King's Landing, sowing discord. Perhaps it would force the Lannisters to keep more men around Joffrey, giving the North and its allies a freer hand in the field. In time, if they could catch Tywin unawares and crush his army, King's Landing might be vulnerable. That was the hope, at least. Jon found himself in the thick of it when smaller skirmishes erupted, leading men alongside Lord Bolton's banners or riding with the Great Jon. He felt the sting of actual battle, the rush of adrenaline, the horror of seeing men cut down. Ghost was ever at his side, silent and savage when threatened. The men he led began to speak of him in reverential tones, not quite sure if he was man or dragonwhelp. He took no joy in the slaughter, but fought valiantly, forging a reputation as a skilled swordsman, an unyielding presence. Even in the chaos, the memories of Ned's quiet strength guided him. Weeks turned to months. The war ground on. Smaller alliances shifted like sand in an hourglass, but slowly, the North and Riverlands created a tenuous coalition with Dorne. Prince Doran Martell's envoys arrived, meeting Jon for the first time in a neutral field near the stone mill. They examined him thoroughly, comparing the lines of his face to portraits of Rhaegar, measuring his courtesy, testing his knowledge of Old Valyrian. Jon answered as best he could, showing them the partial genealogies he had painstakingly translated. They spoke of House Martell's indignation over the murders of Elia and her children, and how, if Jon truly was Rhaegar's son, the Martells would stand behind him, provided he recognized Dorne's autonomy and promised justice for the crimes committed against them. Jon agreed, though the weight of that promise lay heavy on him. He wanted justice for Ned as well, for all those who had died. If that justice meant the Lannisters would be dethroned, so be it. With a tentative alliance in place, forces from Dorne began moving north, or at least preparing to do so once the roads were passable. This gave the king in the north and the would-be Targaryen heir a new advantage, though cunning was still needed to outmaneuver Tywin. One crisp dawn, a rider came from the neck. He carried a letter sealed with the crest of House Reed, signifying that Howland Reed was en route, eager to speak to Jon. The letter claimed knowledge of the Tower of Joy, knowledge of Lyanna's last days, and ended with an ominous line, "I will confirm what only Ned Stark and I knew. Rhaegar's blood flows in your veins." With that, the final puzzle piece was set. Howland Reed's testimony would be powerful. The North, or at least some portion of it, might grudgingly accept the truth if he spoke it. The Southern Lords needed more, but perhaps it would be enough to tip the scales. War councils buzzed anew. If they could bring Howland Reed to stand before the great houses, it might legitimize Jon's claim once and for all. Then, as the rightful Targaryen king, he could demand fealty or pledge alliances that might peacefully persuade certain lords to break from the Lannisters. And if Joffrey refused to yield, there would be open war upon King's Landing. Jon stood by the battlements of Riverrun that evening, gazing at the placid water of the rivers, the sky streaked with dusk. He let the events of the last months swirl in his mind. He had never asked for any crown. He would have been content to serve in the Night's Watch. But fate or the gods had a different plan. Ned Stark's secret, Old Valyrian archives, Rhaegar's lost line, it all converged on him. He had a duty now, to save his sisters, to avenge his father-uncle, to restore order to a realm battered by war. If that meant claiming the Targaryen name, he would do it. But he would do it on his terms, as a man of honor, not a tyrant. Robb joined him on the battlements, silent for a long while. Then he said quietly, "Father would be proud of us both, you know? Proud that we're trying to right the wrongs without losing ourselves to bloodlust." Jon exhaled, a faint tremor in his chest. "I hope so. I miss him. I hate that I never got to ask him, to confirm it, to thank him for protecting me all those years." Robb gave a solemn nod. "We do this for him and for all the Starks we've lost. My father's memory, your mother's memory. The Lannisters can't destroy that." They stood side by side, two young men who had grown up as brothers, each bearing a crown of sorts, each carrying the legacy of House Stark in his own way. The war still lay ahead, savage and uncertain, but there was a sense of unity between them. Winterfell had shaped them both, and though their father was gone, his legacy drove them onward. Jon wrapped his cloak tight against the chill wind, thinking of the dragons of old, the wolves of the north, and the swirl of half-forgotten prophecy that had mentioned a song of ice and fire. Perhaps that was him. Perhaps that was them, joined in a moment of destiny. He did not know where the path would lead, but for the first time he felt the stirrings of purpose, an understanding that he was more than a nameless bastard. He was the blood of the dragon, and the child of Winter's rose. Let the Lannisters quake in their golden hall. Let the realm tremble at the next turn of fate. Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, would forge his own destiny, and if that destiny was the Iron Throne, then so be it. He was done living in the shadows. He would bring the harsh justice of the North, tempered by the ancient fire of Valyria, down upon those who had torn his family apart. He turned to Robb, gave a curt nod, and the two of them gazed out across the Riverlands, preparing for the storms to come. Even without subtitles or heralded declarations, the realm felt the ripple of change as Jon's secret identity spread through whispered rumor and clandestine alliance. Robb's rebellion, perhaps once only a northern cause, now bore the seeds of a much greater war. For who could deny the power of a living Targaryen heir, especially one raised under the stern honor of House Stark? The swords were drawn, the ravens took flight. The old songs whispered in the corners of the world that the dragon and the wolf were united once more, and a new chapter in the history of the Seven Kingdoms was about to begin. Riverrun's walls glowed in the lingering orange of sunset as Jon Snow, called Prince Aegon Targaryen by some, stood looking down at the darkening waters. Beyond the battlements, the rivers still carried the reflection of distant fires, a blur of red and yellow among the wavering lines of dusk. To the north lay the smoking remains of farmland ravaged by the Lannisters. To the south stretched the uncertain path toward King's Landing, where Joffrey Baratheon, if that truly was his father's name, still held Sansa captive. Though the day's end tinted the sky with a semblance of beauty, all Jon felt was a gnawing tension deep in his chest. He thought of Ned Stark again, of the way his father-uncle had calmly met his fate in King's Landing. On these walls, the air seemed thick with memory and regret. If Ned had lived, Jon would have gladly heard the truth from his lips, confirmed by a gentle but firm voice. "You are my sister's son. You are the son of Rhaegar Targaryen." Yet that solace was lost, severed along with Ned's head upon the great September steps. All that remained was the swirling uncertainty that had followed Jon since the day he discovered the torn scroll in that old Valyrian vault. He had begun this journey with the intention of joining the Night's Watch. Now, men bowed to him as "my prince," or whispered "your grace," though none dared say it loudly within Riverrun's walls. Robb approached from behind, each footstep echoing softly. He, too, paused at the embrasure, gazing over the fortress grounds. "You're still out here," Robb said in a quiet voice. "I thought you'd retire after the War Council." Jon turned slightly. Candlelight from within the fortress glimmered against Robb's hair, making it appear more auburn than usual. The grief in his eyes was a mirror of Jon's own. They had grown up as brothers, and now the realm called them both kings of different sorts. Robb, king in the north. Jon, a would-be Targaryen heir to the Iron Throne. The notion felt absurd, yet events had propelled them to these heights. "I needed air," Jon said. The walls felt like they were closing in back in that chamber. Robb folded his arms over the edge of the battlement and leaned forward. I understand. Every day brings new letters, new demands. Dorne wants proof. My own bannermen want me to secure the neck and drive out the Ironborn who took Winterfell. The River Lords want the Lannisters crushed. And meanwhile, Sansa languishes in King's Landing, and Arya is missing. It's too much. Jon could feel the tension in Robb's voice. Too much for one man to handle alone. But you're not alone. We'll manage, somehow. Robb gave a faint nod. Some of the River Lords are uneasy about your claim. They don't mind you leading men in battle, but stepping forward as a Targaryen. It stirs up old memories. They don't forget how Aerys had our grandfather burned alive. They wonder if the son of Rhaegar might harbor the same seeds of madness. Jon exhaled slowly, gaze drifting to the horizon. I'm not Aerys. I never even knew Rhaegar. I was raised in Winterfell, in your father's care. That is who I am, no matter what blood runs in my veins. But they're right to be cautious. I would be as well if I were them. They'll learn to trust you in time, Robb said softly. You fought for them, bled for them, and we have to keep pressing forward. Tomorrow we meet Prince Doran's envoys again. Perhaps more of his men have crossed the Prince's Pass to join us. Jon rubbed his eyes. More men are welcome, but at this rate we'll have an entire host camped around Riverrun, and no one left to do the fighting. We need to move soon, or the Lannisters will rally further. Robb sighed. That is true enough. Tywin is rumored to be near Harrenhal, summoning new forces. We've outmaneuvered him before, but it won't last forever. Meanwhile, we wait for Howland Reed, hoping he'll come with the final proof. That might make the difference in uniting more of the realm behind your name. Or at least, keep them from calling us rebels. Jon swallowed hard at the thought. We're all rebels in some sense, aren't we? The moment Ned died, everything turned upside down. The memory of Ned's execution was raw between them. They stood in silence as the last sunlight dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a bruised shade of purple. At length, Robb stepped back from the walls. I'll leave you to your thoughts. Try not to stay out here all night. We march soon, and I'd rather you rested. Jon nodded, and Robb departed, his footsteps receding. Outside the fortress, the trees swayed in a faint breeze. The air was cool on Jon's face, a reminder that autumn was upon them, that winter could not be far behind. And if winter came while the realm was fractured by war, how many thousands would starve or freeze to death? The question gnawed at him. He tilted his head up, watching the first pale star appear overhead, and closed his eyes against a wave of weariness. He pictured Ghost, prowling among the tents below, silent as a wraith. He pictured the shards of the old Valyrian scroll that had launched him on this path. He pictured Lyanna Stark as she was said to have been, fierce, beautiful, betrothed to Robert Baratheon yet claimed by Rhaegar. Ned's voice in memory whispered, "Promise me, Ned." Jon had never heard the words himself, but they lived in the hush of rumor and the heartbreak in Ned's eyes. He murmured a prayer to the old gods and turned away from the battlements. The coming days would shape the future of the realm, and he would not falter. The encampment around Riverrun stretched in a crescent along the three forks of the river, tents forming haphazard rows. Between them, the men of the north mingled with river lords, exchanging rumors of the war, dicing or sharpening blades. The men from Dorne maintained their own smaller enclave closer to the fortress, their long spears a distinct presence wherever they trod. Dornish banners flapped, sun spears on orange fields, and the northern men watched them with sideways glances. Old resentments lingered, for the Dornish had fought fiercely against the rebellion once, but times changed. The realm now had a new cause or several swirling like crows above a corpse. Jon made his way through the muddy pathways, returning respectful nods from passing soldiers. Some said, "My prince," in hushed tones that sounded uncertain on their tongues. Others gave him strange half-smiles, as though they did not quite know how to treat a man they once called bastard. He endured it in silence, Near the southern edge of camp stood a larger tent flanked by Dornish guards. It was there that Jon was expected for the next meeting. He paused at the entrance flap, summoned his composure, and nodded to the guards. They pulled the flap aside. Inside, braziers glowed with coals, casting waves of heat across the close air. The Dornish envoys wore flowing robes that draped elegantly over their mail, each man or woman with dusky skin and watchful dark eyes. Their leader was Ser Valyrian, a wiry man whose face bore the scars of an old battle. He rose when Jon entered, inclining his head. "Prince Aegon," he said, though he spoke with the faint twist of irony that told Jon he remained cautious. "We were just discussing you." Jon glanced around, finding 2 seats set near a low table draped in orange cloth. "I hope your words were kind," he replied, striving for courtesy. Ser Ryan's lips curved in a polite smile. "We were weighing the possibility of your traveling to Dorne in person. Prince Doran believes that if you showed yourself at Sunspear, giving him and his court the chance to observe you and confirm your heritage, he might declare for you openly without delay. That would bring us more than envoys, my prince. It would bring an army." Jon tensed at the thought. Traveling to Sunspear would take weeks, and the roads grow ever more dangerous. Robb, King Robb, could ill afford my absence that long. And we still wait on Howland Reed, who may arrive any day. Ser Ryan's expression was unreadable. "I understand. Yet the Martells desire solid proof, not just letters. And some in Dorne worry that proclaiming a Targaryen heir without seeing him face to face would look foolish, should it turn out to be a ruse." Jon's jaw clenched slightly. "This is no ruse. I wish I could produce a written statement from Ned Stark, but my father, my uncle, carried this secret to his grave. Until Howland Reed appears, we have only old scrolls and the testimonies of men who trust Ned's honor." Ser Ryan lifted a hand in a placating gesture. "Peace, my prince. I cast no aspersions on you. It's simply my charge, from Prince Doran, to ensure we align ourselves with the true scion of Rhaegar. King Robb's letter was thorough, but many in Dorne recall how Robert's rebellion ended. We want to ensure no pretender misuses Prince Rhaegar's name." Jon exhaled. "Of course. Forgive me. I'm uneasy about how much time we have before Tywin Lannister makes a decisive move." Ser Ryan nodded slowly. "Then it might be best if you wait until Reed arrives. If he can confirm your parentage, Prince Doran's concerns will be greatly eased. In the meantime, my men remain at King Robb's disposal. Our spears thirst for Lannister blood." Jon dipped his head in gratitude. "Thank you. We will not forget. I will see to it that you and your company are given all that you need. Food and supplies are short, but we'll manage." He looked around at the other envoys. Most watched him with studied neutrality. "Is there anything further? Or shall I speak with King Robb about your proposal to travel south?" Ser Ryan exchanged glances with his fellows. "That is all for now. Inform King Robb we stand ready to advance or hold position at his command. But remind him we do not fight for the king in the north. We fight for Prince Aegon Targaryen, if he is who he claims to be." A wry twist curled his mouth. "Yet we are not blind. We see you two share bonds of brotherhood. We will not hamper the North's cause unless it conflicts with Prince Doran's broader goals. Still, be aware. Dorne is first sworn to House Martell. We do nothing without the prince's seal of approval." Jon inclined his head. Understood. The tension in the tent was palpable, yet he respected their candidness. Perhaps it was better to have an ally who spoke blunt truths than honeyed lies. After a final exchange of courteous nods, he made his way out, stepping into the cooler evening air with a swirl of relief. He found that Robb's squire had been waiting outside. The boy Olivar hurried up and bowed. "Your Grace," he said a bit shyly. "King Robb asks for you in the central hall." "Thank you," Jon said. He still felt a pang of awkwardness each time someone bent the knee or addressed him as if he were truly a prince, but he had yet to find a comfortable way around it. In his heart, he was Jon of Winterfell, Ned Stark's boy. The Targaryen name felt like a cloak that fit awkwardly, but he had chosen to wear it, so bear it he must. That evening, The great hall of Riverrun flickered with torchlight. The walls bore the banners of House Tully, trout leaping upon a red and blue field, alongside those of House Stark, the dire wolf of the north, and the smaller standards of various bannermen who had pledged themselves. The wooden floor was covered in rushes that had not been changed in some time, reeking faintly of old straw and spilled ale. The grandness of the keep felt diminished by the war's harsh realities. Robb was seated at the high table, not upon the dais proper but at the side, with a cluster of lords around him. Catelyn Stark stood behind him, her expression grave. Lord Edmure Tully was speaking in low tones. As Jon entered, a hush seemed to ripple through the men gathered about. Many pairs of eyes turned his way. He approached, stepping carefully over a broken reed in the floor, and inclined his head. "You asked for me, Your Grace?" Robb offered a tight smile and gestured Jon closer, motioning for those around them to part. "I did. Word has reached us by Raven from the west. Tywin's host is on the move, heading toward the Blackwater. If we do nothing, he will soon fortify King's Landing, secure the city's gates, and press us from a position of strength." Jon felt his pulse quicken. "So Tywin is abandoning Harrenhal?" "Aye," Robb said, eyes narrowing. "Which leaves Harrenhal less defended, but that fortress is near impossible to hold unless one has a massive force. And taking it might not help free Sansa. If Tywin gets his entire army behind the walls of King's Landing, the city could prove an unbreakable shield for the Boy King, and a place of torment for Sansa." Lord Bolton spoke from Robb's left, voice cold and measured. "A siege of King's Landing in winter would be a fool's errand. The city is large, well supplied from the Reach. If we cannot break them swiftly, starvation could threaten our own lines. Then we gain nothing and lose everything." Catelyn lifted her chin, eyes flashing. "So what do you propose, Lord Bolton?" "Abandon my daughter to the Lannisters' tender mercies." Bolton's face remained expressionless. "I offer no simple solutions, my lady, only caution. We must weigh the cost of a direct assault. If Prince Aegon, if I may call him that, were recognized by more lords beyond the Trident, perhaps we could muster a force from the Stormlands or the Crownlands. We might even turn some of the city's own defenders if they believe they fight for the rightful king. A swift, decisive assault could break Joffrey's hold. But we do not have that support yet." Jon glanced to Robb, uneasy. The words of Bolton rang with a certain logic, but he distrusted the man's coldness. "What of Stannis? Is there any word from Dragonstone?" "He might be open to an alliance if we present him with the truth of Joffrey's parentage." Robb tugged his glove, eyebrows drawing together. "We sent a raven to Dragonstone. No reply yet. Stannis is besieging Storm's End from the last we heard. He may not trust a Targaryen claim any more than he trusts Joffrey's. In Stannis's eyes, he is the rightful heir after Robert's death, no matter what rumor says about Joffrey's blood." A voice near the table muttered, "Stannis is as rigid as an iron rod." Several men murmured agreement. Lord Edmure Tully cleared his throat. "The question remains. Do we press for King's Landing now, risking a siege or a pitched battle against Tywin's combined might? Or do we hold back, attempt to draw Tywin out again in the field?" Catelyn's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "We cannot allow Sansa to remain a hostage indefinitely. And if we do nothing, Tywin grows stronger. By the time we find the perfect moment to strike, the city might be untouchable." All eyes turned to Robb, but Robb shifted his gaze to Jon. The hush was telling. Many of these men had begun to see Jon as the other side of this coin, the Targaryen half that might unify or further incite the realm. Jon inhaled slowly. "If we do press for King's Landing, we need an advantage. Rushing blindly will lead to slaughter. Tywin Lannister is cunning and wealthy. We have cunning on our side too. My father taught us well, but we need more. Could we move swiftly enough to intercept Tywin before he reaches the city? Perhaps pin him against a river crossing?" Robb's eyes glinted with a spark of interest. "Interception could work if our scouts report his movements accurately. But we must not forget he'll be guarded by a large host. And we have fewer men than we did. The Karstarks have not returned, and many of our soldiers remain in the north. reeling from the Ironborn's attacks. "It comes down to risk," Bolton said. "If we commit to intercepting Tywin on the march, we might succeed in dividing his forces. Or we might rush into the jaws of a trap." In the quiet that followed, Jon saw the weight of leadership pressing on Robb. This was the role meant for Ned Stark, for the father who had always seemed so sure-footed in matters of war. "Let's gather fresh intelligence," Jon said at length. "Send out outriders with orders to find Tywin's exact route. If he's crossing the Blackwater Rush or marching near it, we'll know soon enough. Then we can plan accordingly. In the meantime, we hold the men in readiness to march at a moment's notice." Robb blew out a breath of relief, as if grateful for the suggestion that offered a middle path. "Agreed. We don't commit to a direct siege yet. Let's see if we can corner Tywin in the field. If the Lannisters are forced to break off for supplies or if they're spread too thin, we strike." He looked around at the circle of lords. "Return to your men. Prepare them for movement. Keep your scouts vigilant. We will gather again once we have fresh word from the outriders." They murmured assent, though the glances shared among them were heavy with unease. One by one, they filed out. Catelyn followed Robb at a short distance, concern etched deep in her face. Jon lingered last, uncertain. He could sense the swirl of misgivings, the unspoken friction between House Stark's lords and the new Targaryen factor. Yet there was no easy path to victory. This was war, and war devoured men, hopes, and illusions alike. Days stretched on in a tense hush as the outriders ranged west and south, searching for sign of the Lannister host. The nights grew colder. Jon's breath misted in the morning air as he walked the perimeter of the camp, often with Ghost by his side. The white direwolf garnered almost as many curious stares as Jon himself did. Some said it was fitting, the white wolf for the half-Stark, half-Targaryen prince embodying ice and fire. The parallel made Jon uneasy. He did not like being seen as some figure of prophecy. He was just a man trying to keep his loved ones safe. One crisp afternoon, when the sun hung low beyond Riverrun's towers, a small group of riders emerged from the main gate. Leading them was a spare man with short, graying hair, wearing the colors of House Reed. Jon nearly stumbled at the sight. Could it be? He strode forward, heart pounding. The man dismounted, removing his leather gloves. The crest on his surcoat indeed bore the lizard lion of House Reed. The man's eyes flicked across the yard, then settled on Jon with something akin to reverence. Slowly he knelt. "My prince," he murmured. Jon's chest tightened. "Rise. You must be from Greywater Watch." He paused, scanning the man's features. "Are you Howland Reed?" The man shook his head, expression composed. "No, I'm Giles Reed, cousin to Lord Howland. My lord father remains in the Neck, but he sends me in his stead. He regrets that he cannot travel easily. Greywater Watch is difficult to abandon, especially with Ironborn prowling near the coasts. But he wrote this for you." Jon swallowed, deflating a bit at the realization that Howland Reed had not come himself. Still, he accepted the letter, a sealed parchment with the stamp of the Watch's signet. He gestured for Giles to follow him off to a quieter corner of the courtyard, away from curious soldiers. As they stepped near the stables, the air was thick with the scent of hay and manure, but at least it was more private. Jon carefully broke the seal and unrolled the letter. The words were written in a cramped, steady hand. To the one known as Jon Snow, though his true name be Aegon Targaryen, son of Rhaegar and Lyanna, I, Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch, do confirm that Eddard Stark brought an infant from the Tower of Joy, the child of his sister Lyanna and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. I was there, as the last of the living men who fought to protect Lyanna's final moments. I pledged my silence at Lord Stark's request, for the safety of the boy. We feared the wrath of the usurper, who would have destroyed any living Targaryen. Ned Stark named the child as his own bastard to shield him from those who would do him harm. It shames me that I cannot come to you in person, but the war demands I safeguard our home in the Neck. Yet let all men know I stand ready to swear this truth before gods and men if the realm requires it. The child of Rhaegar and Lyanna is no pretender, but a prince hidden in plain sight. So I swore to Ned Stark, and so I swear now. May the old gods and the new preserve you. Howland Reed. Jon's hand trembled on the parchment. Here it was, in black and white, a declaration from the only other living witness besides Ned himself. This letter was the final missing piece many demanded. For so long, a hidden rumor cloaked in secrecy, now spelled out by Howland Reed. The swirl of emotion threatened to overwhelm him. Anger at Robert's potential wrath, gratitude for Ned's quiet sacrifice, yearning for a simpler life, fear of what this truth might bring if widely known. He drew a slow breath and looked up to meet Jill's gaze. "Thank you. Will you swear to these same words in front of those who need to hear it? My men, King Robb, the envoys from Dorne." Jill's Reed bowed his head. "I will, my prince. My lord father wrote the letter in front of me. He entrusted me with it along with his word. I can recount what he told me, though I was not alive when these events took place. I believe it wholeheartedly. House Reed has ever been loyal to House Stark, and by extension, to the cause for which Ned Stark gave his life." Jon nodded, feeling an ache in his throat. "You have my thanks." He paused, rolling the parchment carefully. "Then come, we'll go to King Robb. The men must hear this. Perhaps it will help bring unity." Jills accompanied him into the fortress. They found Robb in the Solar, conferring with Catelyn, Edmure, and the Blackfish. Tension rippled through the air at the sight of the newcomer, but Jon laid the letter out on the table. He read it aloud, voice steady, though inside his nerves felt frayed. When he finished, silence fell. Catelyn's eyes glittered with pent-up emotions too tangled to parse. Robb exhaled through his nose, a sign of relief and fresh worry all at once. Edmure Tully frowned thoughtfully. "So it's true, then?" Another voice confirming that you are indeed Rhaegar Targaryen's son. Catelyn pressed her lips into a thin line. "We suspected as much from the beginning. Ned, my husband, would never have bedded a random tavern wench and fathered a bastard. It always felt impossible for the man I knew. This only cements that suspicion." Her expression was heavy with pain. She had lost so much, and perhaps part of her bitterness over the years had been misplaced, directed at the boy who wasn't even Ned's son. Jon felt no triumph, only a deep ache. Robb's voice roused them from the hush. "This is what we needed." A direct statement from one of the Tower of Joy's survivors. "Jon, my brother, my lord, you can produce this letter to Dorne. It should satisfy Prince Doran's request for proof. Combine it with the scroll from the archives and your close resemblance to Rhaegar's lineage, and we have a solid claim." The Blackfish nodded gravely. "Aye, that might sway more lords to your side as well, if they are already disillusioned with the Lannisters. But we must be precise. If we reveal your identity on a broad scale, the Lannisters will double their efforts to kill you. They know how dangerous a living Targaryen can be to their hold on the throne." Edmure rapped his knuckles lightly on the table. "If it spurs a quicker end to the war, it's worth the risk. Right now, the realm is fracturing among Joffrey, Stannis, and King Robb. Should a Targaryen appear with the backing of the North, the Riverlands, and Dorne, it might unify many lords uneasy with the Lannisters." Catelyn's eyes flicked to Jon, her voice muted. "Is it what you want? To sit the Iron Throne? I recall you once yearned to join the Night's Watch." Jon met her gaze. He saw no easy warmth there, only a flicker of sadness and acceptance. "I never wanted a crown, but I will do what must be done to save my family, to bring peace, or at least to end this war. Joffrey must answer for Ned's murder, for the wrongs done to Sansa, for the chaos inflicted across the realm. If I must claim the Targaryen name openly, so be it. I only hope I don't fail." Robb clapped a hand on Jon's shoulder. "You won't. You have the North behind you, or at least behind me, and I support you fully. As king in the North, I pledge my sword and men to see you on the throne, if that's what it takes to free Sansa and stop the Lannisters." Catelyn bowed her head, lips pressed tight, but said nothing. Edmure and the Blackfish exchanged somber nods. Giles Reed cleared his throat. "I can stand witness if you wish. House Reed will confirm the letter's testimony." Robb squared his shoulders. "Then let us proceed. We'll gather the major lords, men of the North and Riverlands, and the Dornish envoys. We'll read the letter publicly, have Giles speak. Then, if all are in agreement, we'll draw up our next plan of action. One that includes the formal recognition of Prince Aegon Targaryen." He turned to Jon. "It's a grave moment, brother, but it might be the best chance we have to bring a swift conclusion. If you are recognized, we can perhaps rally the Stormlords who once served the Targaryens, or at least those who followed Robert but now see Joffrey as an abomination. We might force the city to surrender without a protracted siege." Jon let out a breath. "Let's hope so. Every day we delay, Sansa's situation grows more dire." A tremor of anger and fear flickered in him, imagining Sansa trapped in the Red Keep, at the mercy of the Lannisters. He'd not seen her since their parting in Winterfell. He still recalled her bright red hair, her talk of songs and knights. Now she was forced to endure a nightmare. "Then we call the banners to the courtyard at midday," Robb said. "We'll do this publicly, so there can be no question of secrecy or forgery." The Blackfish nodded firmly. "Aye, and the men will see that we are unified in purpose. Let us hope it stirs their hearts to fight harder." They dispersed to make arrangements. Giles Reed left with Edmure to stable his horse and find lodging, while Robb and Catelyn moved swiftly to summon heralds. Jon lingered behind, feeling the weight of the next step settle on him. The day he discovered that Valyrian vault, he had never imagined it would lead here, to a public recognition as Aegon Targaryen in the presence of hundreds. Ghost padded in from the hallway, silent as snowfall. The direwolf's red eyes locked on Jon. Then the beast pressed its muzzle against Jon's hand. Jon stroked the thick white fur, drawing a measure of calm from the wolf's presence. "All of us have roles we never asked for," Jon muttered. "But we'll do it for Father, for the North, for the realm if we must." Ghost's ears pricked, as if acknowledging his words. Together they walked out of the solar side by side. By midday, Riverrun's courtyard was thronged with men, the clamor of steel and hushed anticipation mingling. Word had raced through the camp that something momentous would be announced. The banners of each house fluttered from parapets. Bolton's flayed man, Umber's giant, Manderly's merman, Mallister's eagle, Tully's leaping trout, and of course the Stark direwolf. The sun glared overhead, turning the air warm despite the creeping chill that was setting in the nights. A dais had been erected near the main gate. Robb stood upon it in his armor, cloak pinned with the direwolf sigil. Catelyn and Edmure were to his right, the Blackfish and the other High Lords to his left. Ser Ryan Illyrian and the Dornish envoys were assembled as well, their gold and orange attire a bright contrast to the more somber northern colors. Giles Reed, newly arrived, stood near the dais, bearing the letter from Howland Reed. Jon approached from the keep's entryway, a swirl of tension in his gut. He wore simple mail and leather, though at Robb's insistence, he'd pinned a Targaryen sigil to his cloak. The device was hastily made from black cloth cut into a three-headed dragon shape and stitched onto a plain gray background, the best they could do on short notice. The sight of it made him uneasy, but it was necessary. Ghost padded at Jon's side, drawing curious murmurs from the crowd. He climbed onto the dais, standing beside Robb. For a moment, the hush was profound. Hundreds of eyes bored into him. He could feel the sweat beneath his collar, the dryness in his throat. He tried to recall how Ned Stark would have handled this, calm, measured, without flourish. That was the best he could do. Robb cleared his throat, stepping forward. "My lords, men of the North and the Riverlands, and you who come from Dorne, we gather today for a solemn matter. All of you know that I was proclaimed king in the North after my father, Lord Eddard Stark, was treacherously executed by the Lannisters in King's Landing. Now, I stand before you to share a truth that my father hid for the sake of protecting his sister's child." A murmur swept the crowd. Robb held up a hand for silence. Many of you have wondered at Jon Snow, my brother, who was raised at Winterfell as a bastard. But new evidence and witness testimony have come to light. He is no bastard of Ned Stark at all. He is the son of Lyanna Stark and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, born in secret to protect him from the wrath of King Robert. Catelyn stood stiff, her hands clasped, her gaze distant. The crowd erupted into confusion. Exclamations, disbelieving shouts, gasps. Some men turned to each other, voicing shock. Others gazed up at Jon in wonder or suspicion. A few lords crossed their arms, guarded. Robb continued, raising his voice above the noise. We have here Gilles Reed of Greywater Watch, cousin to Lord Howland Reed, who fought at the Tower of Joy alongside my father. Lord Reed has sent a letter, bearing witness to the fact that my father rescued his nephew, this child of Rhaegar and Lyanna, and raised him as Jon Snow to shield him from Robert Baratheon's anger. Gilles Reed will speak now. Gilles stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable with so many eyes upon him, but he drew a breath and spoke clearly. My lords, my lady, good knights, I bring the testimony of Howland Reed, Lord of Greywater Watch. He states that Eddard Stark found his sister Lyanna dying in the Tower of Joy. She had given birth to a boy, fathered by Prince Rhaegar Targaryen. With her last breath, she made Lord Stark swear to protect the child. Lord Stark named him Jon, claimed him as his bastard, and never revealed the truth, for he feared Robert Baratheon's thirst for Targaryen blood. I vouch for Lord Reed's honesty, and we have the written letter sealed with his signet. He held up the parchment. A wave of fresh whispers buzzed through the crowd. The letter was shown to a few lords standing nearby, including Lord Bolton and the Blackfish, who peered at the seal, seemingly satisfied it was genuine. Robb spoke again. Now you know the truth. Jon Snow is, in truth, Aegon Targaryen, but he was raised in the north. He is my brother in all but blood. He stands with us against the Lannisters' treachery. Jon stepped forward, carefully reining in his shaking nerves. I do not claim a birthright to boast or to overshadow King Robb's own crown in the north, he began, his voice echoing in the courtyard's stillness. But I will not stand aside while the Lannisters hold my sister Sansa hostage, while they ravage the Riverlands, while they defile my mother's memory and my father-uncle's honor. I am no usurper. I do not claim the tyranny of the Mad King. But if my claim as Rhaegar's son can help unite the realm against Joffrey, who is no true Baratheon, then I will use that claim. A wave of tension ran through the men. Some nodded, others exchanged uncertain glances. Ser Ryan Illyrian spoke from the side, his voice carrying. Prince Doran Martell has demanded proof. Now we have a letter from Howland Reed. If Prince Aegon truly is the child of Rhaegar, House Martell will not stand by while Elia Martell's murderers remain unpunished. Justice for Elia and her children was denied, but perhaps it can be served now. Men shouted in approval or hammered swords against shields. A surge of excitement and confusion tangled in the air. Slowly, the crowd's clamor merged into a single chant. Stark, Targaryen, Stark, Targaryen. That mix of words thundered off Riverrun's walls, a chant of ice and fire echoing across the yard. Jon felt his heart pound. Robb raised a hand, and the crowd quieted. We fight for our families. We fight to restore peace to the realm. If you stand with us, know that we will march soon to strike at the Lannisters. This is not just the war of the North or the Riverlands any longer. With a Targaryen heir among us, we shall see the rightful king crowned, or see the Lannisters broken. Winter is coming, my lords. Let us end this war before the snows bury us all. The men roared in response, though not all with the same fervor. Some still looked wary. Jon caught glimpses of House Bolton's men exchanging uneasy whispers. Yet for many, there was a sense of renewed purpose. The war had gained a new dimension. Jon stood, letting the noise wash over him. In that moment, he felt Ned Stark's presence as though Ned stood by his side. He remembered the man's quiet sense of duty, the unwavering devotion to family and honor. Perhaps Ned would have hated to see Jon drawn into further bloodshed. But the realm was already bathed in it, and there was no escaping. If taking up the mantle of Rhaegar's son would help end it, then so be it. That evening, the fortress was alive with talk. Soldiers who had never thought to fight under a Targaryen banner argued with those who saw it as an opportunity to unite the realm. The discovery that King Robert had left no trueborn heir, if the rumors of Joffrey's parentage were to be believed, made things more tangled, and talk of Stannis' claim lingered in the background, though fewer men favored supporting him now that a Targaryen lived. In the quiet of a small chamber, Jon, Robb, Catelyn, Edmure, and the Blackfish gathered with Ser Ryan and the highborn lords to plan. Maps were rolled out on the table, pinned by candlesticks. Aware that Tywin was likely pressing on the Blackwater, they debated the best route to intercept or threaten King's Landing itself. Robb traced a finger along the map. If we move along the Gold Road, we might cut off Tywin if he tries to approach from the west. But that leaves us exposed to any Lannister forces in the southern Riverlands. Alternatively, we could cross at the Twins and try a more direct route south. But that means dealing with Walder Frey again. Our last dealings with him were unpleasant. Catelyn's face was etched with distaste. Lord Frey's price was high when we last passed. My daughter's betrothal to one of his brood. He may ask even more if we come to him for help again. Bolton, standing by the shadows, offered his counsel. We might avoid the Twins if we cross the Trident further downstream, but that will slow us, and we may lose the element of surprise. We know Tywin is on the move. Speed is of the essence. Ser Ryan placed a slender finger on the map near Maidenpool. Dorne's forces could move from the Prince's Pass toward King's Landing. If we coordinate, we might encircle the city from the south as well, forcing Tywin to face two fronts. Jon studied the lines, half listening to the swirl of suggestions. At length he spoke quietly. We need to ensure Sansa's safety. If an attack on King's Landing seems imminent, the Lannisters might use her as a shield or threaten her harm to force our retreat. Catelyn's tone turned grim. They might do that regardless, but we have no choice. We cannot simply let them hold her hostage forever. Robb gave Jon a pained look. I know it tears at you to think we might put Sansa at risk. It does the same to me, but every day we wait, they tighten their grip. If we can besiege the city quickly enough, we might force them to parley. The Lannisters value their own lives. Perhaps they'll trade Sansa for safe passage or a chance to keep some portion of their power. Bolton let out a cold laugh. Tywin Lannister is not known for sentimentality, but with all his cunning, he can be forced to terms if the alternative is total destruction. Edmure rapped a knuckle against the map. Then a swift strike is best. Let us attempt to intercept Tywin in the field. If we can break him or even bloody him enough, he might withdraw behind the walls. Then, with Dorne threatening from the south, King's Landing will be starved of resources. They'll have to negotiate. Robb's expression hardened. Aye, so be it. We'll assemble the host within 3 days, cross the Red Fork quickly, and march with all haste toward the Gold Road or whichever route Tywin favors. The Outriders will find his flank. If we seize a swift victory, we proceed to King's Landing before the Lannisters can reorganize. Nods of agreement spread around the table. Ser Ryan added, My men will ride with you. Prince Doran is mobilizing more forces, but they may not arrive in time for this push. Rest assured, though, that if you take King's Landing, more Dornish will come to secure it under Prince Aegon's banner. Jon felt a jolt each time he was called Prince, but he did not refute the title. Thank you, Ser Ryan. Let's hope we can bring this to a swift end. The meeting dissolved into details. Supply lines, which lords would command each flank, how to handle the freed men, who would remain at Riverrun to secure it. Catelyn volunteered to stay behind with a portion of the forces to guard the Tully seat, but Robb insisted she join him if she wished. She shook her head, torn by the desire to rescue Sansa and the duty to her ailing father, Lord Hoster Tully, who still lay bedridden in the upper floors. Ultimately, she agreed to remain behind for the time being, though her heart was clearly not in it. By the time they concluded, the candles had burned low. Each lord took his leave, carrying a swirl of marching orders and strategies in mind. Jon lingered by the table, eyes on the map, as Robb set a hand on his shoulder. "Brother," Robb said softly, "tomorrow we begin preparations. We'll have you address the men again before we ride, if that's all right." Jon nodded, pushing back the lingering sense of unreality. "If it helps them fight for us, I'll do whatever is needed." Robb's grip tightened. "I'm proud of you, Jon. Or should I call you Aegon?" Jon's throat constricted. He managed a small smile. "I think Jon is the name I've lived with. Aegon might be what I am, but Jon is who I am." Robb's expression warmed. "Jon it is. Sleep if you can. The next few days will be intense." Jon nodded. They clasped forearms in a brief show of camaraderie, then parted ways, each weighed down by the knowledge that soon they would ride into the teeth of war with renewed ferocity. He dreamt of ghosts. The dream came in the deep hours of night. He stood in the crypts of Winterfell, torchlight flickering across stone faces. Ned Stark's statue gazed forward, the likeness carved from granite. Lyanna's statue lay beside it, her features hauntingly similar to Arya's, a garland of winter roses in her lap. In the dream, the statues seemed to move, their eyes following him. He heard a voice echo in the darkness. "Promise me, Ned, promise me." Then Ned turned to Jon, face stern but kind, and said, "You must do what is right, my boy, no matter what name you bear. The realm is bigger than we are, but we serve it all the same." Jon tried to speak, but no words came. The torch guttered. A swirl of darkness and cold enveloped him, an icy wind from the north. From the gloom, the shapes of dire wolves emerged, eyes glowing red. A faint roar like dragonfire crackled overhead, yet it sounded muffled by the crypt's walls. When he looked up, the vaulted ceiling turned into a boundless night sky. He glimpsed a fiery comet trailing overhead, red as blood. Then the dream dissolved, and he awoke in a cold sweat. He sat upright in his makeshift bedchamber, heart hammering. Ghost lay at the foot of his bed, ears pricking at Jon's movement. Outside, dawn light seeped into the corridors. A dream, Jon told himself, but it felt like more than that. Felt like a warning or a command, he was never sure which. He got up and dressed quickly. There was no time to brood over omens. War beckoned. The men needed direction. Sansa waited. War, 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 hammered his thoughts with each knot he cinched on his clothing. 2 days later, the Northmen and Riverlanders were on the move. Packs of horses clattered across the drawbridge of Riverrun, carrying knights, sergeants, and footmen with pikes and crossbows. Wagons laden with supplies rumbled behind them, though the supply lines were precarious. Bolton led one flank, the Great Jon another, while small groups of Dornish spearmen served as scouts at Ser Ryan's command. The columns stretched across the rolling landscape, accompanied by the cacophony of hooves, creaking wheels, and men's chatter. Robb rode at the head of the main column, with Jon beside him. The day was overcast, the sky a dull pewter color that pressed low over the land. An ominous hush lay beneath the steady rhythm of marching feet. Scouts cantered ahead, returning intermittently with reports of local villages or sightings of Lannister outriders. So far, no major forces barred their path, but tension hung in the air like a drawn bowstring. Jon rode a sturdy courser, with Ghost loping alongside effortlessly. Occasionally, he glanced at Robb, who wore a fur-trimmed cloak pinned with the direwolf sigil. Their eyes would meet, each acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Around midday, the vanguard came upon a small hamlet, half-burned, with rubble where houses once stood. A handful of villagers cowered by the charred remains of what might have been a barn. Jon felt his stomach twist at the sight of a child's bones, still smoldering in the ash. One of the peasants stumbled forward, clothes scorched, hair singed. He dropped to his knees and begged for mercy, though from what Jon couldn't guess, they were not Lannisters. Robb dismounted, raising a hand in a soothing gesture. "We mean you no harm. What happened here?" The villager, a man old enough that his beard was white, managed to stammer, "Soldiers with the lion crest. They came, burned our homes, took our stores. We tried to fight, but they..." He shuddered, tears carving dirty tracks on his cheeks. My granddaughter was inside the barn when they lit it. We couldn't get her out. A wave of fury rolled through the northern ranks. Jon felt his throat tighten. He knelt beside the old man. The Lannisters will pay for this. There's nothing we can do to bring her back, but we can offer you food, water, some aid. If you can gather the others, we'll do what we can before we move on. The man's eyes trembled, but he nodded. Robb ordered a few wagons of supplies to be shared among the survivors. It wasn't much, given the needs of the army, but it might keep the villagers alive until they could rebuild or flee. As they doled out what they could spare, a hush of mourning and anger settled over the soldiers. Scenes like this were becoming all too common. They left the hamlet behind, continuing their march. Each man carried a renewed sense of rage at the Lannisters' savagery. Jon thought of King's Landing, of the opulence Joffrey enjoyed while these people starved and burned. A swirl of hot anger raged in his gut. If Sansa was forced to endure that snake pit, the day wore on with the weather turning colder. Gray clouds thickened overhead, threatening rain. Just before dusk, riders came galloping from the western hills, cloaks flapping. They reined in before Robb and Jon, breathless. "My lords," gasped the lead scout. "Tywin's host has been spotted crossing near the Windwater to the south. They're heading east, likely toward King's Landing. It looks like at least 15,000, maybe more. They have knights, war machines, supply wagons. They're not moving quickly, but they're definitely marching in that direction." Robb exchanged a look with Jon. 15,000, about as many as they themselves had, perhaps a bit fewer. But Tywin's men were seasoned, commanded by a ruthless commander. "How far from here?" Robb asked. 3 days' ride, maybe less if we push hard," the scout replied. "But they're spread out, and some of their outriders might be closer." Bolton arrived at a canter, his pale eyes flicking from the scout to Robb. "We could attempt a forced march to meet them on ground of our choosing. If we wait for them to cross the Windwater, we risk them slipping past us." Jon inhaled. "A forced march could exhaust our men, especially if the weather turns. But a surprise assault might be our best chance. Tywin might not expect us to be so close." Robb's jaw tightened. "We move at dawn, then. A forced march as swiftly as we can manage. We'll head southeast, see if we can intercept Tywin along whichever route he takes to the city. We must strike before he merges with reinforcements near King's Landing." Word was passed through the columns. Double time in the morning, minimal rest. The men grumbled but understood. Victory might hinge on beating Tywin to the punch. They made a cold camp that night, no large fires, to avoid drawing unwanted attention. A thin drizzle settled over them, turning the ground into mud and dampening spirits. Even so, morale held, bolstered by the memory of the scorched hamlet and the knowledge that revenge lay down the road. Jon huddled beneath a canvas awning, Ghost at his side, reviewing a map by the light of a shielded lantern. Robb joined him, pulling off soaked gloves. "You should get some rest," Robb said quietly. "We'll be riding hard tomorrow." Jon rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I'll rest soon. I keep thinking, if we intercept Tywin and beat him, we might get close enough to King's Landing to force Joffrey's hand. Maybe we can free Sansa without more bloodshed." He let out a shaky breath. "Though I doubt it. The Lannisters will not yield easily." Robb's gaze was somber. "They won't, but we have no choice." He paused. "Jon, if we do break Tywin, and if the city yields, do you truly mean to claim the throne? Would you seat yourself on the Iron Throne?" Jon's mouth felt dry. He looked at the watery glow of the lantern. "I suppose so, to ensure no further pretenders cause chaos. If the realm wants a rightful king, and if that's me, yes, I'll do it. But I don't know how to be a king. I only know how to fight, how to try to be honorable like your father taught me." Robb placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "You'll learn, or we'll have good counselors to guide you. I'm king in the north, but I expect my realm to remain free. We'll stand as allies, not subservient to the south." His voice took on a teasing note. "Even if my own brother is the new occupant of the Iron Throne." Jon managed a half-smile. Of course, I'd not expect the North to bend the knee again. I only want to secure peace. If that means letting each region govern itself as it will, so be it. Robb nodded, satisfied. Rest then. Tomorrow might decide everything. They marched before dawn, the army rousing grudgingly as horns brayed in the rain-dark gloom. Men shoved down cold rations, saddled horses, and cursed the damp. The forced march was brutal, hours of relentless riding, with minimal stops to water the animals. Footmen trailed behind, urged on by drummers beating a steady cadence. By midday, the sun broke through patchy clouds, revealing rolling hills that sloped toward the Windwater's wide banks. Here, the outriders found signs of Tywin's passage, fresh wagon tracks, churned mud from thousands of boots. The Lannisters were only half a day ahead, maybe less. Robb and Jon conferred with the Great Jon and Bolton. They agreed to split the army into two segments to surround Tywin's flank. Bolton, ever cunning, volunteered to lead a swift cavalry detachment around the hills to strike from the rear, while Robb would lead the main force head-on. Jon stayed with Robb as the newly declared Targaryen heir, partly for unity, partly because that was where the largest number of men would be. So they pressed on. Anxiety coiled in Jon's gut as they drew nearer to the fateful clash. He recalled the swirling rumors of Tywin's cunning and the might of Lannister arms. If they failed here, the war might be lost. He clutched the reins, scanning the horizon for any sign of dust plumes or banners. Ghost loped ahead, scouting. The direwolf's keen senses sometimes gave them advanced warning of ambush, though Tywin's men were not easily caught unawares. Near mid-afternoon, the outriders spotted the trailing edge of the Lannister column. It stretched along a shallow ridge, wagons in the middle, mounted knights on the flanks. A swirl of excitement and fear shot through the northern ranks. Robb signaled them to form up. The Great Jon bellowed for men to spread into battle lines. Horns blew. Jon's heart hammered. His mouth went dry. He drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword that Ned had given him. No, that once belonged to House Mormont but was gifted to him for saving Jeor Mormont's life in another life, or so in the main storyline, but here we assume Ned had it or it's a recognized sword of the Starks. If we're being meticulously lore accurate, in the books, Jon received Longclaw at the Wall from Jeor Mormont, but in this alternate timeline, it could have been delivered or possibly given earlier. Let's keep it simpler, he just has a serviceable blade. If needed, we can gently sidestep that detail and say he was gifted a fine sword from Ned. We will not dwell on it. He brandished the blade, the steel catching a glint of the late sunlight. Robb raised his own sword overhead. Their men formed lines, shields front, pikes behind, archers at the wings. The Lannisters, alerted by the horns, scrambled to form their own ranks. Golden lions on crimson fields snapped in the wind. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. Bolton's cavalry had not yet arrived from the rear. Their timing had to be perfect. If they could pin the Lannisters in place, Bolton might charge into the rear. Jon's pulse raced, eyes darting across the chaos. He saw knights spurring forward, footmen forming a shield wall, the Lannister banners swirling in confusion. Robb gave the order. The northern horns blew. The front rank advanced at a steady trot, then broke into a charge. A roar went up from thousands of throats. The earth seemed to quake beneath pounding hooves and racing feet. Jon kicked his courser into motion, staying beside Robb. Ghost sprinted ahead, darting between the lines with fearsome grace. They collided with the Lannister vanguard in a clash of steel and screams. Arrows whistled overhead. Men cried out as lances found flesh. Horses shrieked. Jon felt the jarring impact as his sword bit into the shoulder of a Lannister spearman. He gritted his teeth, yanked the blade free, and parried a strike from a mounted knight. Blood sprayed. The line swarmed around him, men falling, cursing, hacking. He glimpsed Robb locked in combat with a Lannister knight, their blades ringing. Men from House Mallister pressed on the flank, forcing the Lannisters to give ground. For a moment, it looked like the Lannister lines might collapse. But more men poured forward from their rear wagons, rallying beneath a gilded lion banner. The fighting became a brutal melee, surging back and forth on the muddy slope. Jon forced himself to remain calm, to fight with the discipline Ned Stark had instilled in him. Thrust, parry, pivot. He cut down a spearman who lunged at his horse's flank. Another emerged, a sword aimed at his chest. Jon knocked the blade aside and hammered his pommel into the man's skull. The man toppled, but a fresh wave came. Ghost lunged, dragging a soldier down by the leg. Screams rent the air. In the swirling chaos, a Lannister banner-bearer recognized Jon, or at least the Targaryen sigil pinned to his cloak, and shouted, "Kill the pretender!" A knot of men rushed in, eyes aflame with zeal or fear. Jon braced, heart thrumming. Two pressed him at once, swords flashing. He parried furiously, hooves churning beneath him, the horse whinnying in panic. One blade found a gap in his armor near the thigh, slicing shallowly. Jon hissed in pain. He struck back, carving across the man's chest. The soldier collapsed. The second slashed at Jon's arm, barely missing as Jon's horse reared. Jon fought to steady the courser and brought his sword down in a savage arc that caught the attacker across the face. With a gargled cry, the man dropped. Breathing ragged, Jon wheeled his horse. All around, the lines were dissolving into pockets of fighting. Arrows streaked overhead. He glimpsed some of the Grachan's men smashing through a line of red-cloaked archers. Another group of Lannisters was forming to the left, threatening to flank them. Where was Bolton? A horn sounded, distant but growing louder. Jon squinted through the haze of dust and blood. On the ridge behind the Lannister wagons, a mass of riders appeared, banners indistinct at this distance. Then the banners came into focus, pinkish shapes that might have been the flayed man of House Bolton. They poured down the slope, slamming into the unprotected rear of the Lannister column. Chaos erupted in the Lannister ranks. Surrounded on two sides, they faltered. Men turned to fight the new threat, leaving their flanks open to the Northerners pressing from the front. Robb seized the moment, sounding the horn for a general advance. Jon joined the surge, adrenaline burning away exhaustion. They crashed into the disordered Lannisters, hacking and stabbing. Horses screamed. Men fell, shields splintered. Tywin's standard, a golden lion, swayed dangerously in the press. Jon saw a swirl of movement beneath it. Knights in lavish armor, likely highborn Lannister men. He spurred his horse, guiding it closer, cutting down a spearman who tried to bar his path. Another blow connected with Jon's forearm, jarring him to the bone. He gritted his teeth and bashed his assailant with his shield. Ghost streaked past, chasing a Lannister footman who had begun to flee. The entire Lannister center buckled, men scattering toward the wagons. The rearmost lines were in disarray, pinned by Bolton's cavalry. Shouts of surrender and hold mingled in the uproar. The ground became slick with blood, turning the footing treacherous. Amid the bedlam, Jon glimpsed a figure in ornate armor, golden and gleaming, crowned with a lion's head crest. Could that be Tywin himself? The figure turned, sword raised, warding off two Northmen. Then, with a furious blow, he cut down one, forced back the other. Jon spurred forward, though a flicker of fear touched him. Tywin Lannister was older, yes, but famed for his prowess and cunning. As Jon neared, Tywin spotted him. Their gazes locked across the swirl of melee. Tywin's green eyes narrowed. He shouted something lost in the din and spurred his charger to meet Jon's approach. Their swords rang together in a fierce clash. Jon felt the jarring shock from wrist to shoulder. Tywin's horse was larger, heavier, nearly knocking Jon aside. But Jon used his agility, hooking his right knee around the saddle, pivoting to keep balanced. He slashed at Tywin's flank, but Tywin deflected it and riposted with a blow that dented Jon's pauldron. The older man's strength was formidable. Jon's heart hammered. He parried again, trying to find an opening in Tywin's gilded plate. Tywin forced him back, blow after blow, each strike hammered with cold precision. It was all Jon could do to deflect them. Ghost, seeing Jon engaged, tried to circle in, but was cut off by a swirl of Lannister soldiers. Jon barely avoided a thrust that might have pierced his breastplate. Tywin pressed the advantage, lips set in grim determination. But a soldier from House Mallister lunged at Tywin's side, forcing the Lannister lord to turn and block. Jon seized the chance, slashing at Tywin's left arm. The blade scraped across gold plate, leaving a bright gouge but no deep wound. Tywin snarled in anger and kicked the Mallister soldier from the saddle. Before Tywin could recover, Jon thrust forward, aiming for Tywin's unguarded thigh. Tywin twisted in the saddle, but not quickly enough. Jon's sword bit into flesh. Tywin grunted, a flash of pain crossing his face. He swung wildly at Jon, but Jon ducked. With a desperate push, Jon bashed Tywin's chestplate, unseating him. The Lannister lord fell heavily to the churned mud, sword clattering from his gauntlet. Blood seeped from the rent in Tywin's thigh armor. Jon dismounted, sword raised, hearing only the pounding of his own heart. Lannister soldiers attempted to rush forward, but the swirl of northern men blocked them. Tywin tried to stand, but his leg buckled. He glared at Jon with hatred. "Targaryen bastard," he spat, voice tight with pain. Jon's chest tightened. Here was the man who had orchestrated the murders of Rhaegar's wife and children, who had sat at the Mad King's Council, who had unleashed Gregor Clegane on the Riverlands. He had destroyed so many lives. "You took everything from me," Jon said quietly. "From the Starks, from House Targaryen. Now it ends." Tywin's eyes flicked around, seeking a chance. Then, in a final surge, he lunged for his fallen sword. Jon responded on instinct, driving his blade into Tywin's mail. The old man's momentum pushed him onto Jon's steel. Jon felt the impact as the blade slid into Tywin's chest. Tywin coughed, blood flecking his lips. For a moment, the war around them seemed to fade to a distant roar. Tywin's eyes widened, disbelief mingling with fury. Then the tension went out of him. Jon pulled back, letting Tywin sink to his knees in the trampled mud. A slight rasp escaped Tywin's lips, and he toppled, golden armor spattered red. A hush seemed to settle around the immediate circle as men realized what had happened. Tywin Lannister, one of the most powerful lords in Westeros, lay dead, struck down by the man rumored to be Rhaegar's son. A swirl of conflicting emotion hit Jon. Relief, horror, triumph, revulsion at the bloodshed. He wiped his sword on Tywin's cloak, heart throbbing. Then the greater battle roared back to life. Lannister soldiers, seeing their lord fall, wavered. Some dropped their weapons, others fought with renewed desperation. Bolton's riders swept in from behind, capturing the wagon train. Robb's men surged from the front, cutting down pockets of resistance. Within half an hour, the Lannister host was routed or in chains. Horns blared from both sides, calling for a cease in the slaughter. Jon stood, leaning on his sword, panting as the dust settled. Bodies lay strewn across the field, Northern, River, and Lannister alike. The moans of the wounded rose to the overcast sky. Mud clung to Jon's boots, thick with blood and grit. Somewhere in the distance, he saw Robb dismounting, directing men to round up prisoners. Ghost bounded to Jon's side, muzzle smeared with gore. Their victory was clear. Tywin was dead, his army shattered. The path to King's Landing was open. Robb approached, breath ragged, a cut across his brow. He took in the sight of Tywin's body at Jon's feet. Shock flared in his eyes. "You did it, then." A tremor in his voice betrayed relief and something akin to sorrow for the brutality of war. Jon nodded woodenly. "He gave me no choice." Robb gripped Jon's shoulder, ignoring the blood. "We've won a great victory. The greatest, perhaps. Without Tywin, the Lannisters are leaderless. King's Landing is vulnerable." Jon's mind whirled. The realization struck him that with Tywin gone, the Lannisters might desperately cling to Joffrey's claim. But how would they fare without their patriarch's gold, cunning, and authority? "Then we press onward," Jon said, voice hollow. "We must free Sansa. We must put an end to Joffrey's reign." Robb gave a firm nod. "Yes, first we'll secure the prisoners, tend to the wounded. Then we march on King's Landing. This might be the turning point. Men around them cheered or sank to the ground in exhaustion. Bolton, arriving with his cavalry, eyed Tywin's corpse impassively, a ghost of a smile curling his thin lips. The great Jon exulted in victory, roaring for ale. Dornish spearmen hoisted a captured Lannister banner in mock triumph. The day was theirs, but at terrible cost in blood. Jon gazed at Tywin's still form, recalling the ashes of the burned hamlet, Ned Stark's execution, the stories of Rhaegar's children murdered in King's Landing. Justice, he thought, though it felt more like bitter necessity. He turned his gaze south, where the road stretched onward, twisting through farmland and forest, heading inevitably to the great city by the Blackwater. War was not done with them yet. Joffrey, Cersei, and the Red Keep waited. Sansa was still captive. The Iron Throne loomed as a symbol of strife. But Jon felt a stirring of grim determination within him. With Tywin gone, the realms might finally see a chance for peace, if he and Robb could seize it. Ghost nudged Jon's leg, and Jon absently patted the direwolf's head. He stepped away from Tywin's body, leaving it to the crows. He was needed among the living, to lead them, to finish what Ned Stark had begun when he took his sister's son under his protection. The next steps would shape the future of every corner of Westeros. And though he was no polished king, he would do his best to live up to the legacy of Rhaegar's honor and Lyanna's fierce spirit, guided by the memory of Ned Stark's steadfast heart. All night, they tended the wounded, set up makeshift tents across the battlefield. Cries of pain mingled with the flicker of torchlight. Jon found little time to rest. He assisted the healers in triage, pressing bandages to gaping wounds, comforting men who cried out for mothers or wives. Blood slicked his hands. The smell was overwhelming: iron, sweat, rot. This was the cost of victory. Robb worked tirelessly as well, ensuring each soldier, northern or otherwise, received what aid could be spared. The next morning, they sorted the living from the dead. Pyres were built for the fallen, including some from the Lannister ranks who had fought honorably. Tywin's corpse, once stripped of valuables, was placed on a separate pyre at Jon's order. Whatever else the man had done, leaving his body to rot might only breed disease. Let the gods judge him. A large number of Lannister soldiers surrendered. Many bent the knee when word spread that Tywin was slain. A few tried to slip away under cover of darkness, but the outriders hunted them down. Among the captives was Kevan Lannister, Tywin's brother, a more diplomatic man. He approached Robb under a flag of truce, requesting mercy for the men. "We had no part in Lord Tywin's decisions," Kevan insisted. "We only followed orders as soldiers must." Robb regarded him icily, following orders that burned villages, killed small folk, and waged war on House Stark. "We lost our father to your nephew's cruelty." Kevan hung his head. "I cannot deny it. I beg you, treat us as honorable prisoners, if you can find it in your hearts." Jon, standing beside Robb, studied Kevan's face. This was a man overshadowed by Tywin's might. Perhaps he was not evil in the same way, but complicity was complicity. "You shall remain our prisoners," Jon said, tone level. "But we'll not starve you or torture you, if that's your fear. We have no taste for cruelty. Yet you'll stay in our custody until King's Landing is resolved." Kevan bowed stiffly, accepting their terms. From him, they gleaned that Cersei and Joffrey held the city, relying on the gold cloaks and the remainder of the Lannister forces to keep order. If the city realized Tywin was dead, panic might sweep the court. Emboldened, Robb gave orders to march south again. The River Lords, the Northmen, the Dornish envoys, together they bore down upon the roads leading to King's Landing. Kevan, as prisoner, was kept under guard in a separate wagon. The battered remains of the Lannister army were disarmed and marched under watch. Some would likely be offered a chance to swear fealty to the Targaryen heir or the king in the north. Others might be ransomed, and so the next phase began. The march to King's Landing was long, overshadowed by the stench of the battlefield. Wounded men trudged alongside supply wagons, and there were many stops to bury the dead or scavenge for food. The hamper of such a large host slough. their progress, but at least they had no major opposition now. Tywin's host had been the greatest threat in the field. That left only the city itself. During the journey, messages were dispatched to Dorne, the Vale, even to Stannis. The letters proclaimed that Tywin Lannister was slain by Prince Aegon Targaryen in just combat, that the North had triumphed, and that the rightful king now advanced on King's Landing. The effect of this news rippled across the realm. Some lords in the Crownlands, weary of Lannister rule, sent cautious envoys to gauge how they might earn favor with the new claimant. Others, more timid, waited to see how events unfolded. But the shift in perception was real. The Lannisters were no longer an unstoppable power. A Targaryen had returned, with the North and Riverlands behind him. Word reached them that Stannis had made some inroads in the Stormlands, capturing small keeps. He had not, however, responded to the letters sent by Robb and Jon. Whether he intended to march on King's Landing as well, or remain locked in conflict with his brother Renly's former allies, none could say. Another rumor whispered that Renly had been slain by some shadowy sorcery, his alliance with the Tyrells now undone. The Tyrells had retreated to Highgarden, uncertain whom to back. Some speculated the Tyrells might yet throw their weight behind a Targaryen claimant, given the old history of House Gardener falling to Aegon the Conqueror. Yet that was uncertain. It was a realm in flux. As the combined host approached the capital, tension grew among the ranks. Each soldier knew a final confrontation loomed. If King's Landing opened its gates, all might be resolved swiftly. But if Cersei and Joffrey decided to fight, the city walls were formidable. A siege could be long and costly. Food was scarce. The city's population was vast. The memory of the sack of King's Landing during Robert's rebellion lingered. Jon wondered if a second sack might unfold. The thought sickened him. If Sansa was inside, how could he guarantee her safety in a city that might erupt into chaos? As they drew nearer, the roads became more traveled. Refugees fleeing the city carried stories of bread riots and desperation. The price of food soared inside the walls. The gold cloaks patrolled with harsh discipline. Joffrey's cruelty was rumored to be increasing, but the people were cowed by fear. Some refugees openly wept when told that the Targaryen heir and the king in the north were marching to overthrow the Lannisters. "Save us!" they cried, half-crazed by hunger. Jon realized the gravity of what lay ahead. Overthrowing Joffrey wouldn't be enough. The city teemed with small folk who might starve if the supply lines were cut. If a siege lasted too long, King's Landing could become a horror of famine and disease. He thought of the books he had read about the Dance of Dragons, the wars that had ravaged the capital in centuries past. The toll on the people had been monstrous. On a misty morning, the watchmen spotted the spires of King's Landing rising in the distance. The tall red walls, the towers of the Red Keep perched on Aegon's high hill. Jon paused to behold the city, heart pounding. So this was the seat of Targaryen power for centuries, now claimed by a usurping boy king who was no Baratheon. Robb called a halt, assembling the lords for a final council. The great Jon was jubilant, ready to storm the gates. Bolton was more restrained, suggesting intimidation might open them without a costly assault. Ser Ryan Illyrian reported that a Dornish contingent was on the way, but not close enough to join them that day. The city's defenses looked intact, with banners of the crowned stag lion flapping from the parapets. "What say you, my prince?" Robb asked, turning to Jon. Jon studied the formidable silhouette of the city. "We should demand their surrender. We have enough men to form a blockade, at least partially. We can threaten a full siege if they refuse. Let them know Tywin is dead, that there's no hope of rescue from the west. They might prefer negotiation to seeing the city sacked." The lords exchanged glances. Some scowled, thirsting for immediate battle. But Robb nodded. "Aye, we'll do that. No sense losing thousands in a desperate assault if the city might yield. We'll send envoys to the gates, demand Joffrey step down, release Sansa, and acknowledge you as the rightful king." "And what if he kills our envoys or refuses outright?" demanded the great Jon, impatience dripping from his tone. Robb's expression turned grim. "Then we tighten the noose, starve them out or find a breach. But we try reason first. I will not risk Sansa's life or the lives of thousands if we can resolve this without bloodshed. No one could refute that. So, the men moved to surround the city in as strong a blockade as they could manage, though it was never a perfect ring. King's Landing was too large, and the approach by sea was open if the Lannisters still held the royal fleet. But the main roads in and out were soon cut off by northern lines. Camps sprang up along the fields, watchtowers erected from wood. Jon and Robb established their command near the northern gate, from which the King's Road emerged. Tents stretched in rows. The men readied siege engines, though they did not begin bombardment. Under a white flag, they sent 2 envoys, one from the river lords and one from the north, escorted by a small guard, to demand parley at the city's gate. Hours passed. No response came, though watchers on the walls said archers lined the battlements. Finally, near sunset, a lone rider emerged from the gate. It was Ser Meryn Trant of the Kingsguard, wearing pristine white armor over gold-trimmed cloth. He approached warily, eyeing the ring of soldiers. A horn signaled him safe passage. He halted before Robb and Jon, his face like carved stone. "I bring a message from Queen Regent Cersei on behalf of King Joffrey," he declared in a flat voice. "King Joffrey rejects your false claim, Targaryen pretender, and declares that any attempt to breach the city will result in the immediate execution of the hostage Sansa Stark. Withdraw at once or the girl dies." A hush settled over the northern men. Jon's jaw locked. Robb's knuckles whitened around his sword hilt. "Tell your king," Robb said in a quiet, lethal tone, "that if he dares harm one hair on my sister's head, we will tear down every stone in King's Landing and leave none alive." Ser Meryn's eyes flickered with a faint uncertainty, but his voice remained cold. "You will fail as your father did. The Lannisters hold the city. Our archers can pick you off before you breach the walls. And if you try, the girl dies." Before Robb or Jon could speak, the great Jon surged forward, fury burning in his eyes. "You dare speak to us so? We have an army at your gates. We have slain Tywin Lannister. You—" Robb held up a hand, halting the Greatjon's outburst. "The message is heard. Return to your city, Ser Meryn. Tell Cersei that we will not leave without Sansa. And if she kills my sister, no power in this world will save her and her wretched son." Ser Meryn inclined his head without a word and rode away. Jon swallowed back the acid taste of rage. He had hoped for some chance of negotiation, but the Lannisters intended to use Sansa as a shield. That left them few options. "We can't let them starve us out in turn," he said, voice low. "We must find a way to free Sansa before we attempt a full assault. Otherwise, they'll kill her the moment we breach the gate." Robb looked lost for a moment, grief swirling in his eyes. "I know. We have to find another way in or a way to spirit her out. If we had contacts in the city or a stealthy approach, the city is massive. There might be hidden entrances or we might bribe the gold cloaks. They're not all Lannister loyalists. Some might favor a Targaryen return." Bolton's voice slid in, quiet. "Bribery or infiltration is possible. The Red Keep has secret passages, if the old rumors are true, but it would be a delicate endeavor. If any attempt fails, they'll kill the girl." Jon stared at the looming walls. This was the dreaded reality of siege warfare. Hostages, threats, a city full of innocents. He thought of Arya, lost somewhere in the realm, and wanted to scream at the cruelty of it all. Instead, he drew a steadying breath. "Then we find someone who knows those passages well. Perhaps we look among the city's outcasts, or any lords who might prefer us over Joffrey. And we do it quickly. If Cersei realizes her father is gone, she might act rashly." Robb nodded, expression taut. "We'll start with the gold cloaks. Some of them might be open to a discreet approach, money, a promise of amnesty if they open a postern gate. We should also consider a direct approach by boat if we can slip men in from the riverside. The city walls are thick, but the waterfront is vulnerable if they're not adequately manned." The great Jon spat. "Sneaking about like thieves is no way for the North to fight." "Perhaps not," said Robb. "But we must consider Sansa's safety first." He turned to the rest. "We dig in. We'll test the city's defenses with small probing assaults, see how they respond. But we do not commit to a full-scale attack unless we have no choice. Meanwhile, we'll explore infiltration, and we'll keep sending out ravens, urging the city to surrender, telling them Tywin is dead. Maybe the small folk will turn on the Lannisters if hunger becomes dire enough. They murmured agreement, though none looked pleased. That night, the war camp stretched outside the walls of King's Landing, torches flickering under a moonless sky. Jon stared at the battlements, recalling stories of how his father-uncle had once stood outside these very walls with Robert Baratheon, overthrowing the Mad King. Now, ironically, a Targaryen was here to overthrow a false Baratheon. The wheel turned. He prayed to the old gods that he could rescue Sansa without repeating the horrors of the last sack of King's Landing. But as the night deepened and no immediate plan for infiltration emerged, his mind swam with fears. Cersei and Joffrey were cornered beasts, dangerous, unpredictable. The fate of the city and Sansa hung in the balance. Days passed. The siege lines tightened. Food caravans attempting to enter or leave the city were seized. Any peasants found sneaking out reported that the city's mood was grim. Bread riots erupted in Flea Bottom. The Gold Cloaks responded with brutality. Rumors circulated that Joffrey had executed a dozen beggars at the gate as a warning. Yet no official response came from within, beyond the occasional arrow fired at curious scouts. Robb and Jon convened daily, exchanging intelligence. The Great Jon wanted to fling boulders at the walls or use siege towers, but that risked Sansa's life. Spies reported that she was kept in Maegor's holdfast, heavily guarded. Attacking the Red Keep directly would likely mean her death. One afternoon, a pair of men arrived at the blockade, claiming to be gold cloaks willing to smuggle out the Stark girl in exchange for a huge sum of gold and safe passage. The lords were suspicious, suspecting a Lannister ruse. Nonetheless, Bolton questioned them thoroughly. Their story seemed plausible, but no one fully trusted them. They demanded half the gold up front. Robb refused to pay without proof of their sincerity. The negotiations stalled. Eventually, the men slunk away, leaving behind only frustration and deeper mistrust. As morale began to dip, a new factor emerged. A raven from Dragonstone, bearing Stannis Baratheon's seal. Robb and Jon read it by lamplight in the command tent. Stannis wrote that he intended to press his own claim on the Iron Throne, considering Joffrey and Tommen to be abominations born of incest. He had no interest in acknowledging a Targaryen pretender, as he put it. However, he proposed a truce. If Robb and Jon stormed King's Landing and disposed of Joffrey, Stannis would then press them to stand down in favor of the rightful Baratheon line. He made no offer of troops. Robb cursed, crumpling the letter. He wants us to do his dirty work, then hand over the throne to him. He offers nothing in return. Jon frowned. Stannis is a man of duty, but also pride. He believes the Iron Throne is his by law. This letter shows he's unwilling to ally with us, but if we break the city's defenses, he might pounce. Robb tossed the crumpled parchment onto the table. Let him try. If we succeed in taking King's Landing and crowning you, we'll have more men than he can muster. Jon nodded, though the swirl of politics sickened him. Another potential front to fight if Stannis marched from Dragonstone. We must act soon. If the city starves, Sansa starves with it. I can't bear that thought. So the preparations continued. Sapping teams to undermine the walls, boatmen scouring the coastline for hidden coves or unguarded docks, and the forging of more siege equipment. The days bled into nights of tension. The memory of the field of victory over Tywin gave them some courage, but the city's walls stood defiant. Then, one drizzly morning, hope arrived in the form of an unlikely visitor. A hooded figure rode into the camp under a battered cloak, escorted by a patrol of Mal-Lister men who claimed the stranger had approached the lines at dawn. Robb and Jon came to investigate. The figure, dismounting in the mud, threw back the hood to reveal a lean face, thinning hair, and a sardonic smile. Lord Varys, the Master of Whisperers. The man introduced himself, adopting a simpering bow. At your service, your graces. Might I inquire which of you is the Targaryen and which is the Wolf King? The difference is so thrilling. Jon recognized him from descriptions. Varys the Spider, the eunuch rumored to have spies everywhere. Robb narrowed his eyes. You're bold to come here alone. Or did you bring half the city's rats with you? Varys tittered. Oh, dear me. I wouldn't trust the city rats if I were you. I bring words, not an army. My oh my, how quickly times change. Tywin dead. I see rumors are true. The Lannisters are in quite the predicament. Jon crossed his arms. What do you want? Varys spread his hands. Why, I wish to broker a solution that spares the innocent the horrors of another sack. The small folk suffer enough without more bloodshed. King Joffrey grows more volatile by the day. Queen Cersei is feeling cornered. They cling to Sansa Stark as leverage. But with Tywin gone, their gold grows uncertain. Tensions fester in the court. The time is ripe for a well-placed infiltration or a sudden shift in loyalty. Robb's gaze was wary. You mean betrayal within the city? Varys let out a soft laugh. I prefer to call it deliverance, my lord. Many in the Red Keep do not love King Joffrey. The Kettleblacks, for instance, might be induced to open a postern gate for the right price. Some gold cloaks recall the Mad King's tyranny, but they loathe the Lannisters more. If you guarantee their safety and a position in the new order, they might turn. I can help arrange it, for the good of the realm, of course. Jon studied Varys's face. The man's expression was carefully schooled into politeness. Why help us? You served the Iron Throne for years. Why turn against it now? Varys sighed theatrically. I serve the realm, my dear prince. The Iron Throne is but a seat, and whoever sits upon it often forgets their duty to the small folk. If King Joffrey would lead Westeros to ruin, is it not my duty to mitigate the harm? Robb glanced at Jon, then back to Varys. Suppose we humor you. You want to help us take the city without a full-scale assault? We're listening. Varys's eyes gleamed. I propose you orchestrate a feint. Give the impression of launching an assault on the main gate. Meanwhile, with my arrangement, the Kettleblacks or certain gold cloaks will open a smaller gate on the southwestern side, near the river gate or a lesser-known sally port. A select force can slip inside the city, head to the Red Keep, and secure Sansa Stark before the Lannisters can harm her. Then, once the girl is safe, you can open the city gates from within or demand the immediate surrender of all Lannister loyalists. Jon felt a leap of hope. And you're certain you can arrange the opening of that gate? They won't double-cross us. Varys pressed a hand to his chest. Oh, I have many little birds. The Kettleblacks are a cunning lot, but quite fond of coin and the promise of reward under a new regime. As for double-crossing, I'd be present to ensure all goes smoothly. I do so hate for anything to go awry. Robb frowned. What's your price? Varys smiled blandly. Peace for the city. A place in your new court, if Prince Aegon reclaims his father's throne. Some measure of trust, so I might continue my work of protecting the realm from the shadows. Jon's mind spun. Varys was a master manipulator, but this plan might be their best shot to free Sansa safely. Without subterfuge, an assault would be disastrous. We'll consider it. We must devise the details carefully. If you betray us, or if Sansa is harmed, I will personally see to your execution. Varys bowed. I would expect nothing less. I remain your humble servant. You may question me further, or we can begin planning immediately. Time is of the essence, as Joffrey's moods grow uglier, and the small folk more restless. Robb gestured to his tent. We'll talk there. Come. Guards, keep him under watch at all times. Varys complied willingly, exuding confidence. Within the hour, they had a rough plan. A main demonstration at the gate, siege towers prepared to distract the defenders, while a hand-picked force of skilled fighters slipped through the southwestern sally port at midnight, guided by one of Varys's trusted men. They would scale the Red Keep from the inside, secure Sansa, and hopefully corner Joffrey and Cersei before they could react. The risk was enormous. A single betrayal or alarm could see Sansa killed. But the alternative was a slow starvation of the city or a full-scale assault that might cost thousands of lives. Jon volunteered to lead the infiltration force personally. I must be the one. I won't leave Sansa's fate to chance. Robb hesitated, but recognized the strength of Jon's resolve. Then I'll lead the main demonstration. The men will see me at the gate, distracting the bulk of the defenders, drawing the gold cloaks to that side. You slip in quietly with your chosen group. May the gods be with you, brother. Jon clasped Robb's forearm. And with you, we'll do this for Sansa, for all of us. Midnight found Jon crouched in the shadow of an overgrown ditch near the southwestern walls of King's Landing. The night was dark, clouds blotting the moon. A handful of men accompanied him, Grey Wind, presumably with Robb, but Ghost had insisted on following Jon. Among the infiltration party were battle-hardened Northmen, agile Riverlanders, and a few Dornish spearmen known for stealth. In total, about 20 men, including Gilles Reed. Varys knelt beside Jon, whispering instructions. Far off at the main gate, the thunder of siege engines sounded. Fires glowed, silhouettes of ladders bristled in the gloom. The Lannisters would be focused there, or so they hoped. The southwestern portion of the city walls was less heavily guarded, though archers might still lurk. Varys's contact, a black-clad figure who gave his name as Osney Kettleblack, appeared on the ramparts near a sally port. He flashed a small lantern 3 times, the prearranged signal. Jon's heart pounded. If this was a trap, they'd be shot like fish in a barrel. But the gate creaked open, just a sliver at phi. RST. Then it swung wider, enough for a man to slip through. Jon signaled his men. One by one, they darted across the open ground, pressing themselves against the wall's base. Ghost padded silently, fur bristling with tension. No shout of alarm, no volley of arrows. Jon clenched his jaw and moved forward, stepping through the narrow door. Inside was a cramped tunnel, unlit but for the faint glow of a single torch. He glimpsed the face of Osney Kettleblack, an unsavory grin curling the man's lips. "Welcome to King's Landing, your grace," Osney muttered. "Got your gold." Jon eyed him coldly. "You'll have it once we reach Sansa unharmed. Betray us, and no amount of gold in the 7 kingdoms will save you." Osney nodded, and Varys hummed with false cheer. "Oh, do hurry. We mustn't keep the wolves waiting." They crept through the passage, emerging into a small courtyard behind a low storehouse. The city air smelled of refuse and desperation. In the distance, the booms of the siege towers crashing against the main gate carried on the wind. Sporadic shouts echoed from the walls. Osney led them through narrow alleys, avoiding patrols. Twice they heard the tramp of booted feet, but no one ventured into these back ways. The hush of slumbering slums enveloped them, though a few windows flickered with candlelight. They passed crumbling hovels, the stench of offal overwhelming. Starving faces peered from doorways, too cowed or frightened to raise alarm. At last, they approached the Red Keep's outer perimeter, a looming silhouette of red stone. Guards in Lannister colors patrolled the walls above, but apparently they were more focused on the city gates. Varys guided them to a discreet postern door half hidden behind an overgrowth of brambles. Another Kettleblack, or possibly the same one, was waiting with a ring of keys. He quietly unlocked the door, nodding them inside. They entered the Red Keep's lower levels, dark corridors of stone lit by torches at intervals. At every corner, Jon's men advanced in pairs, dispatching or subduing any guards they found. The tension was near unbearable. Sansa was somewhere above, in Maegor's holdfast if rumors were true. They had to reach her before word spread of infiltration. They climbed a winding stair. Ghost prowled silently, muzzle low. On one landing, they surprised 3 gold cloaks playing dice. One made to shout, but a Dornish spear lanced his throat. The other 2 died in seconds. Jon grimaced at the brutal necessity, pressing on. At last, they reached the courtyard of Maegor's holdfast, a fortress within a fortress. Tall walls surrounded it, a drawbridge leading to its main gate. Guards patrolled the walkway, torches flickering in the gloom. Jon signaled his men to spread out, bows at the ready. If they could take the guards quietly, they might slip inside. But fate was unkind. One of the Lannister guards glanced down from the walkway and spotted movement. "Intruders," he bellowed. An alarm bell began to clang. Arrows whistled from Jon's archers, striking 2 guards. Another guard sprinted for the alarm ropes, but a Northman's arrow took him through the back. The damage was done, though bells rang through the Red Keep. "Go!" Jon shouted. They rushed the drawbridge. A volley of crossbow bolts met them. One struck Gilles Reed in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another killed a Dornish spearman instantly. Jon raised his shield, feeling the impact of a bolt that glanced off the edge. Ghost snarled, bounding forward. Jon's men battered down the gate, arrows covering them. They gained the courtyard inside Maegor's holdfast. More Lannister guards emerged from side passages, but the infiltration force fought with desperate fury, cutting them down. The corridor leading to the tower where Sansa was said to be held was within sight. Jon led a rush, slashing aside a guard. Blood slicked the floor. He roared Sansa's name. Another wave of crossbowmen appeared. Ghost lunged at them from the flank, scattering their aim. Jon's men crashed into them with swords and spears. A corridor branched off. Varys pointed. "That way, up 2 flights of stairs. The Queen's apartments are beyond, but Sansa may be in the tower." He glided aside, letting Jon's group push forward. They bounded up the steps, footfalls echoing. A large Lannister knight in ornate armor blocked the landing, sword raised. Jon recognized Meryn Trance's sneer. "You'll not take the girl," Trance snarled. He swung his blade in a vicious arc. Jon parried, the force jarring his shoulders. The corridor was cramped, the air thick with the smell of sweat and blood. Trant pressed forward, hammering at Jon's guard. One blow nearly knocked Jon's sword from his hand. But Jon fought back with the savage determination of a wolf cornered. He slammed his shield into Trant's face, staggering the knight. Then he struck at the gap near Trant's armpit. The blade bit deep, drawing a choked cry. Trant dropped to one knee. Jon ended it with a thrust through the visor. He kicked the knight's body aside and raced up the final stairs, men close behind him. They entered a corridor lined with ornate tapestries, lit by flickering torches. At the far end was a heavy door, guarded by a single gold cloak with terror in his eyes. He dropped his spear, raising his hands. "Don't kill me. They forced me to guard her." Jon knocked him aside, ignoring his pleas. He tried the door, barred from the inside. A Northman produced an axe, hacking at the wood. Ghost paced anxiously. A woman's scream emerged from within. "Stay away from me, Sansa!" Jon shouted, voice cracking. "It's Jon. I'm here to help you." Something on the other side scraped. Then the door opened a crack, revealing Sansa's pale face, eyes wild with fear. She recognized him, tears brimming. Jon pushed the door open fully and stepped in, finding her trembling in a small, lavish bedchamber. She wore a torn gown, her hair unkempt. The moment she saw him in his battered armor, cloak pinned with the Targaryen sigil, she let out a sob of relief and rushed into his arms. "Jon, gods, you're alive!" she cried, clinging to him. He held her tight, voice breaking. "We have you, Sansa. You're safe now." Behind him, the men formed a defensive ring, listening for more guards. Sansa's face was stained with tears. "Joffrey said he would kill me if Father's army didn't leave. I was so scared." Jon smoothed her hair. "I know. You're safe. We're getting you out of here." He turned to his men. "We have to move. The alarm is raised." They guided Sansa into the corridor. Ghost nuzzled her hand, making her gasp softly, then smile through tears. But the respite was fleeting. Down the stairwell they heard shouting. Reinforcements were coming. Jon's men braced for a desperate escape. They hurried Sansa along side passages, avoiding the main hall where the Lannisters would mass. Twice they fought small skirmishes. Sansa pressed behind a shield wall. Each time, Ghost leapt into the fray, tearing at the Lannisters' ankles, sowing chaos. Their progress was slow, but the infiltration plan had done enough damage that the garrison was in disarray. Finally, they emerged onto a rampart overlooking the keep's courtyard. Torches flared below. An entire company of gold cloaks stood arrayed, blocking the main exit route. The way they'd come was also cut off by Lannister reinforcements. Jon cursed, scanning for another route. Then Varys appeared from a side stair, waving them over. Quickly, there's a rope leading down to the yard behind the stables. We can slip out to the postern if we're swift. They followed him, half carrying Sansa. A rope dangled from the rampart's edge. Below, a narrower yard led to a hidden passage. "We'll cover you," a Northman said, gripping Jon's arm. "Go with the lady." Jon nodded, but before he could move, a chilling voice echoed from behind them. "Stop them!" Cersei Lannister stood on an adjacent balcony, flanked by archers. Her face was twisted with rage, hair disheveled. Joffrey peered out from behind her, pale and furious. "Kill them!" Joffrey screeched, pointing at Sansa. "Shoot them all!" Arrows whistled. Jon yanked Sansa down using his shield. The men scrambled for cover. One arrow grazed a Dornish spearman. Another struck a Northman in the thigh. "We have to jump now," Jon shouted over the chaos. One by one, they began lowering themselves by the rope. The archers leaned out, but the angle was difficult. Sansa clung to Jon, trembling. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I won't let you fall," Jon promised. He helped her onto the rope. She managed a few steps down, arms shaking. Then Jon slid after her, guiding her feet, ignoring the hiss of arrows overhead. Ghost waited, whining, unsure how to follow. The direwolf might have to find another route or leap. A Northman was last up top, covering their descent with a bow. Then he too grabbed the rope and slid down, arrow fletchings rattling in his quiver. They reached the yard, stumbling on loose cobblestones. Above, Cersei's enraged screams echoed, and Joffrey shrieked for more men. Jon and the infiltration group dashed for the stable door. More arrows flew, pinging off stone. One buried itself in the shoulder of a Riverlander, who collapsed with a grunt. Another soared dangerously close to Sansa, but Jon shielded her. They crashed through the stable, scattering frightened horses. Varys guided them to a hidden corridor behind a stack of hay bales. The corridor led to the postern door they'd used to enter. Outside, the ring of the city's alarm bells pounded. Lannister reinforcements might already be in the streets, but the Kettleblack men presumably kept a route open. They emerged into the alley, hearts pounding. "This way," Varys hissed. They twisted through narrow lanes, Sansa clinging to Jon's arm, tears streaming. At one point, a group of gold cloaks spotted them from afar and shouted. Arrows whined, striking the mud. Jon's men returned fire, dropping to, and pressed on. Finally, the infiltration party reached the southwestern Sallyport. Kettleblack was there, wide-eyed. "Hurry!" The gate was half open. Beyond, Jon glimpsed the open night and the lines of northern torches in the distance. They poured through the gate. The moment the last soldier cleared the threshold, Kettleblack yanked the door shut, locking it behind them. The group collapsed onto the muddy ground, gasping for breath. Ghost reappeared, panting heavily, muzzle spattered with fresh blood. He must have found a way around or leapt from the ramparts. Sansa sobbed in relief. Jon cradled her, ignoring his own wounds. They had done it, they had snatched Sansa from the Red Keep. Shouts came from within the city walls as Lannister men realized the infiltration force had escaped. But the door was barred from the outside now. They'd need to bring rams or heavy tools to open it, giving Jon and his men time to reach safety in the siege camp. Shortly after, they reached Robb's lines. The main assault on the gate had only been a distraction, so the casualties were limited. Robb nearly wept when he saw Sansa. She flew into his arms, sobbing anew. The men roared in triumph at the sight of a rescued Stark. Within hours, news spread through the camp. Sansa Stark was safe. The last Lannister hold on the Stark family had slipped away. Joffrey, Cersei, and their loyalists were cornered in the Red Keep, battered from within by riots and from without by an encircling army. A wave of jubilation swept the northern lines, joined by relief among the Riverlanders and Dornish. Jon stood near the command tent, blood drying on his armor. Sansa was with the healers, resting. Robb emerged from checking on her, eyes misty. "Thank you, Jon," he whispered. "You saved her. I'll never forget it." Jon clasped Robb's hand. "We all did. Now we can focus on forcing the city to surrender. With Sansa out of danger, Joffrey's threat means nothing." Robb nodded, a fierce light in his eyes. "We'll bring them down, and then the throne is yours if you want it, or it's ours, together, forging a new peace." Jon exhaled, the enormity of the moment washing over him. One step at a time. The city might fall by sunrise, or they might hold out a bit longer. Either way, the Lannisters are done. Tywin is dead. Joffrey has no real allies left. The realm needs a king who can end this madness. Robb nodded. "And that king is you, Rhaegar's son, raised as a Stark." Jon gave a rueful smile. "We'll see if the realm agrees, but I'll do my best to lead them, as Father Ned Stark would have wanted." Robb gripped his shoulder warmly. Then they turned to face the city's looming silhouette, where the lights burned behind stone walls. Dawn was near, pale light outlining the spires. The final act of the war approached. Jon drew a breath, thinking of Lyanna, of Ned, of all the sacrifices made. He was here with a rightful claim, an army of wolves at his back, and a city trembling at his feet. In a few more hours, or days at most, King's Landing would either surrender or be taken. And then, at last, the Targaryen banner, the dragon of old Valyria, would fly again over the Red Keep, borne by a man who had once been a nameless bastard in Winterfell. Robb would be king in the north, and Jon the king on the Iron Throne, forging an alliance of ice and fire. Sansa's rescue, Ned's memory, the battered realm's hopes. They were all in Jon's keeping now. As the first faint rays of sunrise gilded the horizon, he stood with Robb, ready for whatever dawn would bring. The songs of knights and halls might call him Aegon Targaryen, the rightful heir, but in his heart he would always remain Jon, a Stark as much as a dragon. And on this day, at least, that was enough to shape a new destiny for the Seven Kingdoms.